Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the vast mythology of Warhammer 40,000, where demigods wage eternal war across a million worlds, where legends are written in blood and fire, there exists a Primarch whose story has been largely overshadowed by the more flamboyant tragedies of his brothers. His name was Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon, and his tale is one of the most profound and misunderstood narratives in the entire setting. While the galaxy remembers the betrayal of Horus, the fall of Fulgrim, and the sacrifice of Sanguinius, few truly appreciate the significance of the iron-handed warrior who fell first among the loyal Primarchs, whose death sent shockwaves through the Imperium that still reverberate 10,000 years later. This is the story of a Primarch who believed in strength not for its own sake, but as a means to an end, and a master craftsman who could shape reality with his bare hands. A warrior whose tactical genius was overshadowed only by the circumstances of his death. A leader whose teachings were twisted into something he would have abhorred. Ferrus Manus stands as perhaps the most tragic figure among the Emperor's sons, not because of how he fell, but because of how thoroughly his legacy was misunderstood. The irony is thick enough to taste. The Primarch who wanted his sons to embrace their humanity became the spiritual father of a chapter that rejects it. The warrior who created weapons of breathtaking beauty is remembered primarily for his brutal pragmatism. The strategist who might have turned the tide of the heresy died before his full potential could be realized. And perhaps most painfully, the Primarch who forged the deepest friendship among his brothers, was killed by that very friend, in a betrayal that encapsulated all the horror the heresy would come to represent. Ferrus Manus deserves better than to be remembered merely as the first Primarch to die in the Horus heresy. He deserves to be understood for what he truly was, a visionary leader whose death robbed the Imperium of one of its greatest assets, a craftsman whose works inspired awe in even his superhuman brothers, and a warrior whose uncompromising nature masked a deeper wisdom that his sons would spend millennia failing to comprehend. So settle in, because we're about to explore the life, death, and enduring influence of the Gorgon. We'll walk the volcanic plains of Medusa, witness the forging of legendary weapons, and stand beside him in the crucible of the Great Crusade, and ultimately watch as everything he built came crashing down on the blood-soaked wastes of Istvan V. This is the story of Ferrus Manus, the most underrated Primarch in Warhammer 40,000. Birth of Iron, the forging of a Primarch on Medusa. The story of Ferrus Manus begins, like that of all his brothers, with an act of cosmic theft. When the Chaos Gods scattered the infant Primarchs across the galaxy, tearing them from their gestation pods in the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, each was cast to a world that would shape them in profound ways. Some landed on paradise worlds, others on death worlds. Ferrus Manus crashed onto Medusa, and the planet itself trembled at his arrival. Picture this scene, if you will. A gestation capsule screaming through the cloud-choked atmosphere of a volcanic hell world, burning a trail across the sky bright enough to be seen from pole to pole. The people of Medusa, hardy nomadic clans who scraped out existence on mobile fortress cities, looked up in awe and terror as a new star blazed overhead. The capsule struck the highest peak on the planet, a mountain called Kara-Ashi, the ice pinnacle. The impact didn't just crater the summit, it shattered it entirely. The explosive force of that landing sent shockwaves rippling across the entire planet. Mountains toppled. Great chasms opened in the earth. The tectonic plates, already unstable on this geologically active world, shifted and buckled with such violence that the Medusans would later say the mountains themselves shook to pieces. This was no gentle arrival. This was a cataclysm that announced the coming of something that would reshape their world forever. Deep within the ice and rock of the shattered peak, buried in a tremendous explosion of steam and debris, lay an infant who would become legend. But Medusa was not a world that gave up its secrets easily. and it would be years before that child would emerge from the frozen wastes of the far northern ranges. What happened during those years remains one of the mysteries surrounding Ferrus Manus. Did he grow to maturity alone in those frozen caverns, sustained by the accelerated genetics that made him more than human? The folklore of Medusa suggests he did, that the silver-eyed giant who eventually walked out of the ice pinnacle had never known the touch of another living being during his formative years. If true, this solitude would explain much about the Primarch he would become. As a young man, fully grown and possessed of strength that made him seem divine to the people of Medusa, Ferrus began to explore his surroundings, and it was in these explorations that he made a discovery that would change everything. Deep within the mountain, where his gestation pod had impacted, he found something that didn't belong on this primitive world. Runes. Electroconductive stalagmites. Chambers too precisely carved to be natural formations. An X mark on his pod that matched symbols he found etched into the walls. What Ferrus Manus had stumbled upon, though he couldn't have known it at the time, was a Necron tomb world, or at least the remnants of one. The ancient, deathless Xenos had once claimed this planet, and though they had long since departed or entered their great sleep, they had left behind more than just empty halls and mysterious symbols. They had left behind a guardian, a weapon, a test. During his explorations of these underground complexes, Ferrus inadvertently awakened something that had slumbered for countless millennia. A colossal biomechanical creature, part machine and part living metal, a serpentine horror that the Medusans would come to call a Xeanoth, the great silver worm. The beast erupted from its ancient prison and escaped into the wider world, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The young Primarch pursued it. Of course he did. Ferrus Manus was not one to leave threats unanswered or challenges unmet. What followed was an epic hunt across the volcanic hellscape of Medusa, through regions so hostile that even the hardy clan nomads avoided them. The Land of Shadows, they called it, a place where the earth itself seemed intent on killing anything foolish enough to trespass. The Canticle of Travels, the most famous of Medusan legends, recounts the trials Ferrus faced in his pursuit of a Xeanoth. He battled through regions of perpetual volcanic eruption, where the air itself could sear lungs and the ground might give way to molten rock at any moment. He fought degenerate mutants, twisted things that had once been human before the toxic environment, and who knows what ancient contamination had warped them into monsters. He even encountered what the legends described as living dead cyborgs, creatures whose decayed flesh hung from corroded metal bodies like tattered banners. Were these failed attempts by the Necrons to create servitors from human stock? The reanimated remains of the planet's original human colonists? We'll likely never know. But Ferrus persevered, because that's what he did. That unbreakable will, that refusal to accept defeat, was as much a part of him as his enhanced genetics. Finally, after what the legends suggest was months of pursuit, he cornered a Xeanoth in the deepest, most hellish region of the Land of Shadows. The battle that followed pushed even a Primarch to his limits. A Xeanoth was impervious to conventional harm. Its body was composed of some form of living metal, flexible yet stronger than the ceramite that would one day armor the Emperor's space marines. Ferrus struck at it with whatever weapons he could fashion from the volcanic landscape, but nothing worked. The creature simply reformed, its metallic flesh flowing like liquid to seal any wound. It was then that Ferrus Manus demonstrated the problem-solving brilliance that would later make him such an effective military commander. If he couldn't cut the beast, couldn't crush it, couldn't break it through force alone, then he would use the environment itself as a weapon. He lured a Xeanoth to the banks of a river, but not just any river, a river of molten lava, a flow of liquid rock so hot it glowed white even in daylight. What happened next entered into Medusan mythology and would shape the Primarch's identity for the rest of his life. Ferrus grabbed the great silver worm with his bare hands and held it down in the molten lava. You have to understand what this meant. A river of lava hot enough to melt through stone, to reduce bone to ash in seconds. And Ferrus Manus, driven by will that simply would not accept failure, plunged his hands into that inferno to hold the creature down until it finally died. The pain must have been indescribable. Even a Primarch's enhanced physiology, capable of withstanding wounds that would kill a normal human 100 times over, had its limits. The flesh of his hands burned away. The nerves screamed. But Ferrus held on, because letting go would mean defeat, and defeat was not something he could accept. When he finally pulled his hands from the lava, expecting to see nothing but charred bone, he discovered something miraculous. The living metal of a Searnoth's body had fused with his own flesh. Where his hands had been were now appendages covered in a silvery liquid-like substance, necrodermis. The same material that comprised the bodies of the ancient Necrons themselves. It was flexible as skin, yet stronger than any armor. It could withstand temperatures that would vaporize normal matter. And most remarkably, it granted him an intuitive understanding of technology, a connection to the mechanical world that went beyond mere knowledge into something approaching communion. Ferrus Manus emerged from the land of shadows changed. He was no longer merely a lost Primarch trying to survive on a hostile world. He was now the silver-handed giant of Medusan legend, a figure of such obvious power and capability that even the fiercely independent clan warriors couldn't help but see him as something more than human, something divine. But here's where Ferrus proved himself different from many of his brothers. When other Primarchs found themselves on primitive worlds, they often conquered and united their peoples. Magnus on Prospero, Guilliman on Macragge, the Lion on Caliban, all became rulers who brought their worlds into eras of unprecedented unity and prosperity. Ferrus took a different approach. He didn't unite the clans of Medusa. He didn't end their constant warfare. Instead, he encouraged it. This wasn't cruelty, though it might appear so at first glance. Ferrus had a philosophy, born from his own trials in the land of shadows. He believed that struggle bred strength. That competition forced improvement. That hardship created resilience. The clan wars of Medusa, brutal as they were, served a purpose in his eyes. They weeded out weakness. They forced each generation to be stronger than the last. What he did do was share knowledge. And he descended into the ancient machine tombs beneath Medusa's surface, those Necron remnants that held technological secrets far beyond what the clans possessed. He fought the dark engines and corrupted guardians that still defended those ancient vaults. And he brought back salvage, strong metals, and most importantly, understanding. Ferrus became a teacher to the Iron Fathers, the tech priest shamans who served as both spiritual and technological leaders for the clans. He showed them how to forge better weapons, how to build stronger machines, how to coax life from the ancient technologies they'd been worshipping without truly understanding. Under his tutelage, Medusa experienced a technological renaissance. The clan's mobile fortress cities became more sophisticated. Their weapons became deadlier. Their understanding of the machine grew deeper. But he never imposed peace. He never demanded they stop fighting each other. Because in Ferrus's philosophy, that struggle was essential. Remove it, and the people would grow soft. Protect them from hardship, and they would lose the edge that made them strong. It was a harsh philosophy, yes, but it came from a place of genuine belief. Ferrus Manus thought he was making his people stronger, better able to survive in a galaxy that showed no mercy to the weak. This worldview would follow him into the stars when the Emperor finally came to claim him. It would shape how he led his legion. It would influence his relationships with his brother Primarchs. And ultimately, it would be twisted by his sons into something he never intended. A bitter irony that would haunt his legacy for 10,000 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the silver-handed giant walked among the clans of Medusa, waiting without knowing he was waiting, for the day when the sky would split once more and deliver unto him his true purpose. The Master Smith, when hands become art. If there's one aspect of Ferrus Manus that most people overlook, it's this. He was one of the greatest craftsmen the galaxy has ever known. Not just among Primarchs, not just among humans, among all the countless species and civilizations that have risen and fallen across the Milky Way. Ferrus Manus stands as a master artisan whose works inspired awe in beings who had witnessed wonders beyond mortal comprehension. The necrodermis that encased his hands wasn't merely armor or a weapon, and it was a tool of creation unlike anything else in the Imperium. Ferrus needed no forge, no hammer, no traditional implements of the smith's trade. He could take raw metal, heat it with the bioelectric energy that coursed through the living metal of his hands, and shape it with his bare fingers. Imagine watching him work. The metal would glow white-hot at his touch, becoming as malleable as clay. Those silver hands would move with impossible precision, feeling every imperfection, sensing every flaw in the molecular structure of the material he shaped. But it wasn't just the physical capability that made him remarkable. The necrodermis granted him an intuitive understanding of technology that bordered on precognition. He could look at a piece of machinery and immediately understand not just how it worked, but how it could be improved. And he could envision weapons that existed only in his mind's eye, and then bring them into being with such skill that even his brother Primarchs, beings of godlike capability in their own right, would stare in wonder. Let's talk about some of his creations, because they tell us so much about who Ferrus was as an artist and as a being. The most famous, of course, is Fireblade, the sword he created for his brother Fulgrim. This wasn't just any power weapon. Fireblade was a masterwork that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. The blade itself was forged from a golden alloy that Ferrus had personally perfected, a material that could hold an edge sharp enough to cut through ceramite while remaining flexible enough never to shatter. The power field that sheathed the blade didn't just disrupt molecular bonds like most power weapons, but it generated heat, intense, focused heat that made the sword burn with the temperature of a forge's heart. Even when the weapon was inactive, it radiated warmth. When ignited, it blazed like a star brought down to mortal hands. Fulgrim himself, the Phoenician, the Primarch whose entire legion was devoted to the pursuit of perfection, declared that Fireblade was worthy of the legendary hero Nuada Silverhand. Coming from Fulgrim, the most critical and discerning of all the Primarchs when it came to art and aesthetics, this was praise of the highest order. But Fireblade wasn't Ferrus's only legendary creation. He also crafted weapons for several of his other brothers, though these receive less attention in the histories. For Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders and himself a master smith, as Ferrus created a bolter whose barrel was designed to resemble the gaping maw of a dragon. Now, you might think this was purely aesthetic, a concession to Vulcan's Drake Slayer mythology. But no, the dragon mouth design served a functional purpose, helping to dissipate heat and manage the weapon's recoil in ways that standard bolter designs couldn't achieve. It was typical Ferrus, finding ways to make beauty and function inseparable. For Horus, before the War Master's fall, Ferrus forged a sword that Horus favored even before the Emperor gifted him the legendary Thunderhammer Worldbreaker. For Lorgar, he created the mace Illuminarum, a weapon that would serve the Wordbearer well before his fall to chaos, twisted it into something dark. Each of these weapons was a masterwork. Each represented hours or weeks or months of focused effort, and each was given freely because Ferrus believed in the strength of the brotherhood between the Primarchs. It's worth noting here the difference between Ferrus and Vulcan as craftsmen, because it illuminates something important about the Gorgon's character. Vulcan was, without question, a master artisan. His works were beautiful to behold, perfectly proportioned, adorned with intricate detail that transformed functional weapons into works of art. A Vulcan creation was something you would display in a museum, something that would make you stop and appreciate the aesthetic achievement it represented. Ferrus's works were different, not lesser, just different. Where Vulcan might spend time adding decorative flourishes and ensuring every curve was pleasing to the eye, while Ferrus focused on what he called precision and utility. His weapons looked functional because they were designed function first. They were beautiful in the way a perfectly designed machine is beautiful. where every element serves a purpose and nothing is wasted. There's an elegance in that approach, a purity that spoke to Ferrus's core philosophy. Vulcan himself apparently found Ferrus's method of creation somewhat disconcerting. The way Ferrus would simply punch metal into shape with his bare fists, the way he could feel the molecular structure and intuitively know exactly where to apply pressure, how much heat to generate, when the piece was perfect. It was too direct, too raw, too much like watching someone reshape reality through sheer force of will, which in a sense was exactly what Ferrus was doing. But here's the thing that really needs to be understood about Ferrus Manus and his relationship with craftsmanship. He didn't create these weapons out of vanity or a desire for recognition. He created them because making things was how he understood the universe. For Ferrus, the act of taking raw materials and transforming them into something greater was more than just a hobby or a skill. It was philosophy made manifest. When he worked metal, he was engaging in a process of improvement that mirrored what he believed should happen in all aspects of existence. You took something in its base form, you identified its weaknesses, and you eliminated them through skill and effort. You didn't accept limitations as permanent. You didn't settle for good enough. You pushed toward perfection, even knowing you might never reach it. Because the pursuit itself was what mattered. This is crucial to understanding what Ferrus really believed about strength and weakness, and why his philosophy has been so catastrophically misunderstood by his sons. When Ferrus talked about eliminating weakness, he wasn't advocating for the brutal, mechanistic purging of all things human that the modern iron hands practice. He was talking about constant self-improvement, about identifying your flaws and working to overcome them, about refusing to accept your current limitations as your final form. The famous "flesh is weak" mantra that defines the modern iron hands? It's not even originally Ferrus's words. According to accounts from the Great Crusade era, it was actually Vulcan who first said it, and he said it as a compliment. During the 184th expedition, when the Iron Hands and Salamanders jointly liberated the Shoksua cluster from greenskin dominance, the campaign had been brutal beyond anyone's expectations. The fighting was so intense, so relentless, that even the Primarchs felt the strain. At one point, Ferrus remarked in jest that his arm was tired from killing so many greenskins. Vulcan, ever the one for philosophical statements, replied, "The flesh is weak, but deeds endure." He meant it as a celebration of what they had achieved, a reminder that even though their physical bodies might tire, the legacy of their actions would outlast their mortal limitations. It was a message of humility, not condemnation. A reminder that even demigods are subject to physical law, but what they accomplish transcends those limitations. Ferrus embraced this idea, but not in the way his sons would later interpret it. He believed that yes, flesh had limitations, but that was precisely why you had to work harder, push further, never accept those limitations as absolute. The flesh might be weak, but through discipline, through training, through constant improvement, you could transcend that weakness without losing your humanity in the process. There's a passage from the Nemerel Scrolls attributed to Ferrus himself that makes his actual beliefs heartbreakingly clear. He acknowledged that his legion had begun replacing their hands with metal in his honor. He saw this as a problem, not a triumph. He explicitly stated that he was troubled by this practice, that it represented a dangerous drift towards seeing the natural, the human, as something to be despised rather than improved. And here's the truly tragic part. Ferrus had a plan to fix it. He recorded that when the Great Crusade was over, when the fighting was done and humanity was finally safe, he would strip the living metal from his own hands. He would instruct his legion to recant their distrust of flesh and bone. He would turn them away from their obsession with the mechanical and teach them to relearn the mysteries of organic life. Because he understood, even if they didn't, that their growing hatred of what was natural was the first step toward a corruption more insidious than any chaos could offer. But the crusade was never finished. The fighting never ended, and Ferrus died before he could course-correct the legion that had taken his philosophy and twisted it into dogma. His sons, left without his guidance and traumatized by his death, but doubled down on the very practices he had planned to eliminate. They thought they were honoring him. They thought they were becoming more like their father. In reality, they were becoming the inverse of everything he had hoped for them. This misunderstanding of Ferrus's beliefs cuts to the heart of why he's so underrated as a Primarch. People see the modern Iron Hands, cold and mechanical, purging their humanity in pursuit of some twisted ideal of perfection. They assume this is what Ferrus wanted. They judge him based on what his sons became, not on what he actually taught or believed. But if you look at his works, at the weapons he created, you see a different story. Each piece he forged was unique, individual, tailored to the warrior who would wield it. He didn't mass-produce identical weapons. He created bespoke masterworks, in each one a reflection of both the smith and the intended user. That's not the philosophy of someone who saw humanity as weakness to be purged. That's the philosophy of someone who valued individuality, who saw potential in unique combinations of strength and skill, who believed in improvement but not homogenization. When Ferrus worked metal in his forge, he was engaged in an act of creation that required intuition, feeling, artistic vision. These are not mechanical processes. They're deeply human ones. The fact that he used living metal hands to perform them doesn't change that fundamental truth. He was, at his core, an artist who happened to specialize in weapons of war. And like all true artists, he was trying to express something through his work, trying to communicate a vision of what could be. That vision wasn't a galaxy of emotionless, mechanized warriors. It was a galaxy where humanity had overcome its weaknesses not by cutting them away, but by tempering them like steel in a forge. Heat and pressure don't destroy metal, they make it stronger. Ferrus understood this. His sons, tragically, did not. Brotherhood forged in fire, the bond between iron and perfection. Among all the relationships between the Primarchs, few were as profound or as well documented as the friendship between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim. These two couldn't have been more different in temperament and approach, yet they formed a bond that was considered one of the strongest in the entire brotherhood of the Emperor's sons. Understanding this relationship is essential to understanding Ferrus himself, one because it reveals aspects of his character that his dour reputation might otherwise obscure. The first meeting between the Gorgon and the Phoenician took place on Terra itself, beneath Mount Narodnya in the Ural Mountains. This was home to one of the greatest forges of the Unification Wars era, a sprawling complex of workshops and manufactorums where the artisans who had once served the Terrawat clan continued their craft in service to the Emperor's growing Imperium. Ferrus had been brought to Terra not long before, fresh from Medusa, and he had naturally gravitated to the forges. Despite his Primarch status, despite the armies he now commanded, and the worlds he was expected to conquer, he still felt most at home with his hands in molten metal, creating and refining and improving. The Forge Masters had been teaching him the accumulated technological knowledge of Terra, and he was demonstrating the capabilities of his living metal hands, showing what could be achieved when Primarch physiology met ancient craft. Into this scene walked Fulgrim, resplendent in his purple and gold, accompanied by his elite Phoenix Guard. The Primarch of the Third Legion had heard about this new brother who supposedly possessed hands of living silver and wanted to see for himself. You can imagine the moment. Ferrus, covered in soot and sweat, standing before a forge with his hands literally glowing with heat, shaping metal with the casual ease most people might shape clay. And Fulgrim, whose legion was devoted to the pursuit of perfection in all things, watching with an expression that probably cycled through skepticism, amazement, and intense professional interest. Now, here's where accounts differ on the exact sequence of events, but the end result is well documented. At some point during this first meeting, after the initial introductions and the inevitable posturing that seemed to accompany any gathering of Primarchs, someone, and legends don't agree on who suggested a competition. A contest to see who could create the finest weapon. Ferrus and Fulgrim would each return to their private workshops and forge a masterwork, and then they would compare the results. For Ferrus, this must have been both exciting and slightly insulting. Exciting because he genuinely loved his craft and would relish any opportunity to push his skills to their limit. Slightly insulting because, well, he had hands made of necrodermis that could literally shape metal through direct contact. It wasn't exactly a fair competition, but Fulgrim was insistent, and Ferrus was never one to back down from a challenge. What followed were 3 months of near constant work. Both Primarchs withdrew to their workshops and threw themselves into their projects with the single-minded intensity that only beings of their caliber could maintain. Fulgrim worked in his flagship's fabrication chambers, surrounded by the finest tools and materials the Imperium could provide. Ferrus worked in more Spartan conditions because he'd never needed elaborate workshops. The forge was wherever he decided to set up, and his hands were all the tools he required. The results of this competition became 2 of the most legendary weapons in Imperial history. Fulgrim created Forgebreaker, a thunderhammer of such exquisite craftsmanship that it made other master-crafted weapons look like crude approximations. The haft was carved from blackwood from Chemos, Fulgrim's homeworld, and inlaid with precious metals forming patterns of lightning bolts in gold and silver. The head was shaped like an eagle's beak, with pointed wings spread wide. It could level a mountain with a single blow, or so the saying went, and looking at the weapon, you'd believe it. Ferrus, for his part, created Fireblade. We've talked about this sword before, but it bears repeating in this context. The golden blade that burned with the heat of a forge, that could cut through ceramite like cloth, that represented the pinnacle of what could be achieved when Primarch skill met perfect materials. It was, in every sense, if Ferrus's answer to Fulgrim's perfection, his statement that precision and utility could create beauty as profound as any aesthetic consideration. And then came the moment that defined their relationship, when they finally revealed their creations to each other, when each Primarch held his work and studied what his brother had achieved. They both did something that no one expected. They each declared the other's weapon superior to their own. Fulgrim looked at Fireblade and saw something worthy of the legendary Nuada Silverhand, a hero from Terran mythology whose exploits were the stuff of legend. Ferrus looked at Forgebreaker and swore that only the thunder gods of ancient Nordic legend were fit to bear such a magnificent weapon. It wasn't false modesty or politeness. Both Primarchs genuinely saw in the other's work a quality that surpassed their own achievement. Without another word exchanged, they swapped weapons. Fulgrim took Fireblade. Ferrus took Forgebreaker. And in that exchange, they sealed a friendship that would become one of the defining relationships of the Great Crusade. Think about what this moment represented. 2 beings created to conquer a galaxy, engineered for war and leadership and domination, finding connection through artistic appreciation and mutual respect.
You know, I've been covering Warhammer lore for quite a while, and Ferrus Manus is one of those characters that really gets under my skin. Not because he's bad, but because of how dirty Games Workshop did him. Here is a Primarch who Gullyman literally called the key to the Dauntless Few, and most fans couldn't tell you 3 things about him beyond he had mental hands and died first. What frustrates me most is how the Iron Hands completely missed the point of everything their dad tried to teach them. Ferrus literally wrote down that he planned to remove his own metal hands after the Crusade to show his sons that augmentation was a tool, not an ideal. And what did they do after he dies? They turn flesh is weak into their entire identity and start cutting off body parts. It's like if your dad said, work hard to improve yourself, and you interpreted that as never sleep again. And I think that's why I wanted to make this video. Ferrus deserves better than being remembered as just the guy who died at Istvan. He was brilliant, he was complex, and his story was more tragic than people realize. Plus, honestly, I'm tired of everyone sleeping on Gorgon while they argue about whether Gullyman or the Line is better. Ferrus could have been right there with them if he'd survived. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the story.
This wasn't about conquest or glory or expanding the Imperium. This was about 2 craftsmen recognizing mastery in each other and choosing to honor that recognition in the most meaningful way possible by carrying each other's work into battle. But the friendship that grew from this foundation was built on a shared admiration for craftsmanship, but that admiration came from fundamentally different perspectives. Fulgrim appreciated craft for its aesthetic beauty. He saw weapons and armor and artwork as expressions of the creator's vision of perfection, manifestations of the ideal forms they sought to achieve. When he looked at a well-made sword, he saw the hours of painstaking labor that went into making every curve perfect, every edge flawless, every detail exactly as it should be. Ferrus approached craftsmanship differently. For him, it was about precision and utility. A weapon was beautiful if it performed its function perfectly, if every aspect of its design served the purpose of making it more effective. Where Fulgrim might add a decorative element because it pleased the eye, Ferrus would add a feature because it improved the weapon's balance or enhanced its capabilities in some subtle but meaningful way. His beauty was the beauty of optimization, of elegant solutions to complex problems. Yet despite these different approaches, or perhaps because of them, they found common ground. They could spend hours discussing the merits of various alloys, debating the proper angle for a blade's edge, arguing about whether a particular design choice enhanced or detracted from a weapon's overall excellence. These were conversations that would have bored most of their brothers to tears, but Ferrus and Fulgrim thrived on them. Their friendship manifested in more than just philosophical discussions, though. The Iron Hands and Emperor's Children frequently operated together during the Great Crusade. As their legions developed a close working relationship, fighting side by side on dozens of worlds. One of the most significant of these joint operations was the campaign against the Diasporex. The Diasporex were a human civilization that had chosen to abandon the Imperium's embrace and strike out on their own into the void. They'd allied with various Xenos species, creating a fleet-based society that moved through the stars seeking resources and new homes. To the Imperium, to the Emperor's vision of united humanity under his banner, the Diasporex represented everything that was wrong with the scattered human colonies. They were separatists, Xenos lovers, traitors to the species. Ferrus and Fulgrim led the combined forces of their legions against the Diasporex with the implacable certainty that what they were doing was right and necessary. But the campaign was symbolic of their brotherhood, two legions working in perfect coordination, their different strengths complementing each other. The Emperor's Children brought their trademark precision and coordination. The Iron Hands brought overwhelming firepower and unrelenting assault. Together, they were unstoppable. But the campaign also revealed cracks in the relationship, hairline fractures that wouldn't become apparent until much later. Fulgrim's growing obsession with perfection was leading him down paths that Ferrus found troubling, even if he couldn't quite articulate why. The Phoenician was becoming more critical, more demanding, less satisfied with anything that fell short of his increasingly impossible standards. Ferrus, for his part, was growing ever more rigid in his beliefs about strength and weakness, ever more convinced that hardship was the only true teacher. There was an incident during the Diasporex campaign that would, in hindsight, prove prophetic. Fulgrim's personal gunship, the Firebird, came under heavy attack and found itself in serious trouble. Ferrus, seeing his brother in danger, personally flew his own vessel into the fray to render assistance. It was a moment of brotherhood, of one Primarch risking himself for another, without hesitation or calculation. Fulgrim was deeply moved by the gesture, and it reinforced the bond between them, but it also planted a seed in Fulgrim's mind. He began to believe that this bond, this friendship, was special enough to transcend anything, that it was strong enough to survive any trial, that Ferrus would understand, would support him, no matter what choices he made. Yet this belief would prove catastrophically wrong. As the Great Crusade progressed, both Primarchs continued to pursue their own visions of perfection. Fulgrim sought it in the aesthetic, in the creation of works so beautiful they would be remembered forever. Ferrus sought it in the practical, in making humanity strong enough to survive any threat. They shared a goal, making things better, but their paths toward that goal were diverging. Then came the blade, the Leia blade. Fulgrim and his legion encountered a Xenos species called the Leia during one of their campaigns. The Leia were creatures of excessive sensation, dedicated to the pursuit of pleasure and perfection, in ways that should have been warning signs to anyone paying attention. In their temple, Fulgrim found a sword of such exquisite craftsmanship that it took his breath away, and a sword that seemed to call to him, that promised to be the perfect weapon he'd been seeking all his life. He took it, and with that act, he doomed himself, and eventually his brother. The sword was inhabited by a demon of Slaanesh, the dark god of excess and sensation. It began to whisper to Fulgrim, subtly at first, feeding his obsessions and magnifying his flaws. It told him that the Emperor was holding humanity back. That true perfection required freedom from the restrictions of the Imperium. It showed him visions of what could be achieved if he would just let go of his outdated loyalties. And slowly, insidiously, it began to corrupt the Phoenician from the inside out. Ferrus noticed the changes in his brother, but he misinterpreted them. He thought Fulgrim was simply becoming more focused, more dedicated to their shared pursuit of excellence. He didn't see the corruption creeping in because he trusted Fulgrim implicitly. That trust was about to be weaponized against him in the cruelest way possible. Among the dauntless few, Ferrus's place in the Brotherhood. To truly understand Ferrus Manus' significance, we need to examine how his brothers viewed him. Because while he might be underrated by modern fans of the setting, his fellow Primarchs knew exactly what he was capable of, and they respected and, in some cases, feared that capability. The most telling assessment came from Roboute Guillemot, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, and arguably the most analytically minded of all the Emperor's sons. Guillemot had a habit of categorizing his brothers, as of assessing their strengths and weaknesses with the dispassionate eye of a strategist, planning for every contingency. And in his private assessments, he identified what he called the dauntless few. These were the 4 Primarchs who, in Guillemot's estimation, most perfectly embodied what the Emperor had intended when he created the Primarch project. They were the ones who reflected the best qualities of their father's design, whose legions most closely matched the ideal of what the Space Marine legions should be. The 4 were Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, Leman Russ of the Space Wolves, and Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands. But here's the crucial detail that often gets overlooked. Of those 4, Guillemot specifically noted that Ferrus was the key, not Sanguinius, but who was beloved by all and whose wings marked him as obviously touched by the divine. Not Dawn, whose gifts as a strategist and builder made him invaluable to the Imperial war machine. Not Russ, whose ferocity and loyalty made him the Emperor's executioner. Ferrus, the Gorgon, was the key, the essential element that made the dauntless few complete. Why? What did Ferrus bring that the others didn't? Let's think about it systematically. Dawn brought unshakable fortitude and defensive genius. Sanguinius brought inspiration and the ability to unite disparate forces through pure charisma. Russ brought the willingness to do what others couldn't, to be the monster when monsters were needed. These are all crucial capabilities, but they're also somewhat specialized. Each of these Primarchs excelled in their particular domain, but had clear limitations outside it. Ferrus was different. He combined strategic brilliance with tactical flexibility. He understood both the grand sweep of a campaign and the gritty details of individual engagements. He could plan complex multi-theater operations, while also leading from the front when necessary. He had the technical knowledge to outfit and equip his forces optimally, the strategic vision to deploy them effectively, and the tactical acumen to respond to changing battlefield conditions. More than that, he had the will to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory, not out of cruelty or bloodlust like some of his more savage brothers, but out of a cold calculation of cost versus benefit. If a world needed to be brought into compliance and peaceful surrender was impossible, Ferrus would bring the hammer down without hesitation. If a threat needed to be eliminated, and the only way to do it was through overwhelming force, he would provide that force without a second thought. This combination of abilities made him uniquely valuable. He was the all-rounder among the specialists, the one who could fill any role the Great Crusade required. Need someone to crack a heavily fortified position? Send Ferrus. Need someone to prosecute a long campaign against a technologically advanced foe? Send Ferrus. Need someone who would see the mission through no matter how long it took or how high the cost? Send Ferrus. His relationships with his other brothers reflected this versatility. With Fulgrim, as we've discussed, yet he shared artistic interests and mutual respect. With Vulcan, he had a friendly rivalry over craftsmanship, each pushing the other to greater heights of skill. With Horus, before the War Master's fall, he had a working relationship based on mutual competence and shared goals. With the more savage Primarchs like Angron or Russ, he maintained professional courtesy, even if he didn't particularly enjoy their company. But there was one brother with whom Ferrus had a particularly interesting dynamic: Perturabo of the Iron Warriors. On the surface, they should have been close. Both were masters of technology and siege warfare. Both believed in the superiority of cold logic over emotional considerations. Both built legions that emphasized mechanical excellence and overwhelming firepower. Yet they never developed the friendship they might have. Why? Because underneath their surface similarities, they were fundamentally different men. Perturabo was consumed by bitterness, by a sense that he was underappreciated and used without thanks. He kept a list of grudges, real and perceived, and nursed them like treasured possessions. His genius was tainted by resentment. Ferrus had no such weakness. He didn't care about recognition or appreciation beyond the respect of those whose opinions he valued. He didn't need to be thanked for doing his duty. The work itself was the reward. The satisfaction of a job done well was all the payment he required. This attitude probably grated on Perturabo, who saw it as either false modesty or evidence that Ferrus was too simple to recognize when he was being used. The truth, of course, was more nuanced. Ferrus understood perfectly well when he was being assigned difficult, thankless tasks. He just didn't care. He'd been created to be the Emperor's hammer, and hammers don't complain about being swung. This fundamental difference in attitude meant that while Ferrus and Perturabo might respect each other's abilities, they could never be friends. There's an incident that illustrates Ferrus's capabilities and his standing among his brothers. During the Great Crusade, there came a time when rumors circulated that the Emperor was planning to retire from active command and leave one of the Primarchs in charge as his successor. Multiple Primarchs believed they were the natural choice for this position, and each had their own plans for proving their worthiness. Ferrus decided that if the Emperor was going to choose a successor based on capability, then he would demonstrate his capability in the most direct way possible. He organized a joint campaign involving forces from the Iron Hands, Emperor's Children, Thousand Sons, and Ultramarines. The target was the Gardenal, a technologically advanced human empire that had been causing problems for Guilliman's forces. Ferrus's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would take command of this combined force, crush the Gardenal before Guilliman could arrive with the main body of the Ultramarines, and thereby demonstrate that he was capable of leading multiple legions effectively. It was bold, ambitious, and exactly the kind of direct approach you'd expect from the Gorgon. The campaign started well. Ferrus's tactical acumen and the combined might of 4 legion contingents made short work of the Gardenal's defensive positions. But then things went sideways in a way that revealed both Ferrus's strengths and his flaws. The Gardenal leadership, seeing that they were losing, requested a parley under a flag of truce. They claimed they wanted to discuss terms of surrender. Ferrus, ever pragmatic, agreed. A quick surrender would save lives on both sides and allow him to complete the campaign that much faster. He went to the meeting expecting to dictate terms. What he found instead was an assassination attempt. The Gardenal leader was encased in a suit of advanced power armor, essentially a primitive but effective dreadnought, and he had a 90-something-year-old psyker subordinate with him. They had no intention of surrendering. They intended to kill a Primarch and demoralize the Imperial forces. The fight that followed showcased both why Ferrus was so feared and why he wasn't infallible. The elderly psyker attempted to break Ferrus's will by delving into his mind, seeking moments of weakness or self-doubt that could be used against him. What the psyker found instead was something he couldn't have anticipated. Ferrus actually cherished his defeats, treasured the moments when he'd failed or fallen short, because those were the moments that taught him the most. Each loss had been a gift, an opportunity to identify weakness and correct it. The psyker's attack backfired spectacularly, but during this mental assault, Ferrus lost his cool. The rage that he normally kept under tight control, that Medusan fury that came from growing up on a volcanic hell world, erupted. He tore into the Cardinal with a ferocity that bordered on berserker fury, killing them both, but losing the calculated precision that normally characterized his fighting style. The incident taught him an important lesson about his own limitations. He was not invincible. His temper, when provoked, could override his tactical judgment. This self-awareness, this ability to recognize and learn from his mistakes, was part of what made him so effective as a military leader. Unlike some of his brothers who saw any admission of weakness as intolerable, Ferrus actively sought out his flaws so he could correct them. After the Cardinal campaign, Ferrus apparently became convinced that if he ever got another chance to duel the Emperor, as he had when they first met on Medusa, the outcome would be different. And not because he'd beaten the Emperor the first time he hadn't, but because he'd learned from that defeat, had improved himself based on the experience. This wasn't arrogance. It was the natural conclusion of his philosophy of constant improvement. His brother Primarchs recognized this quality in him. They knew that Ferrus would never stop growing, never stop refining his skills, never accept that he'd reached his final form. In a brotherhood of beings who were already beyond superhuman, Ferrus stood out as someone who refused to rest on his considerable laurels. He was always pushing, always striving, always seeking the next challenge that would force him to evolve. This made him invaluable to the Great Crusade. While other Primarchs might plateau, might reach a level of competence and then coast on their natural advantages, and Ferrus was constantly improving both himself and his legion. Every campaign made the Iron Hands more effective. Every battle refined their tactics. Every engagement taught them something new. When Ferrus Manus fell at Istvan V, Guilliman heard the news along with reports that Vulcan and Corax were also down. His response was telling. Of the three, he said, he would miss Ferrus most of all, not because he loved him more than Vulcan or Corax, not because they'd been particularly close friends, but because Ferrus represented a capability that couldn't be easily replaced, a combination of skills and mindset that was unique among the Primarchs. The dauntless few were reduced to 3, and the one Guilliman had identified as the key was gone, killed before he could reach his full potential, and before he could demonstrate just how crucial he would have been to the loyalist cause in the dark years that followed. The Emperor's Hammer, Military Campaigns and Achievements. To understand why Ferrus Manus should be ranked among the greatest military leaders in Imperial history, we need to look at what he actually accomplished during the Great Crusade. Because the record of achievement is staggering, even by the standards of the Primarchs. Thousands of worlds fell to the Iron Hands under Ferrus's leadership. Thousands. Each one represented a campaign, a military operation that required planning, logistics, tactical execution, and strategic vision. Some were simple compliances, where the mere appearance of a Space Marine Legion was enough to convince local leadership to join the Imperium. But many more required actual warfare, sieges that could last months or years, battles against foes who possessed technology and capabilities that would have destroyed lesser armies. The Iron Hands developed a reputation that preceded them across the galaxy. When word spread that the 10th Legion was approaching a system, it sparked what historians later called a wave of piety and faith. entire planetary governments suddenly became very motivated to examine themselves, to root out any hint of weakness or corruption, to ensure they met the standards that Ferrus Manus would demand. This wasn't spiritual faith in the Emperor, not primarily, though that was certainly a component. This was fear, pure, rational fear of what would happen if the Iron Hands found you wanting. Because Ferrus didn't do half measures. If a world resisted, if its people showed weakness or corruption, the response was overwhelming and merciless. The Iron Hands would crush resistance with such thoroughness that it served as an object lesson to every system within 100 light-years. But here's the crucial distinction. Ferrus wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He didn't enjoy inflicting suffering. He saw harsh measures as regrettable necessities, as the price that had to be paid to forge a stronger, better humanity. Every world that resisted and was crushed served a purpose. It showed others what awaited those who chose the wrong path. It demonstrated that weakness would not be tolerated in the Imperium the Emperor was building. The Iron Hands' tactical doctrine reflected Ferrus's personal philosophy translated to the scale of legion warfare. They favored overwhelming firepower concentrated at key points. They deployed heavy armor and mechanized infantry in numbers that other legions couldn't match. They had closer ties to the Mechanicum than almost any other legion, which meant they had access to rare and powerful technologies that gave them significant advantages in certain types of warfare. Their vehicle and dreadnought arsenals were massive, comparable only to the Iron Warriors in terms of sheer numbers of armored assets. But where Perturabo's legion deployed these assets, primarily for siege warfare, Ferrus used them with more flexibility. The Iron Hands could conduct siege operations, yes, but they could also prosecute rapid mechanized campaigns, execute deep strikes into enemy territory, or engage in the kind of grinding attrition warfare that broke enemy morale through sheer relentlessness. One aspect of Ferrus's military genius that often goes unnoticed was his ability to coordinate with other forces. The Great Crusade wasn't a series of solo campaigns where each Primarch did their own thing in isolation. It required constant cooperation between legions, coordination with army units, integration of Mechanicum forces, and diplomatic maneuvering with newly compliant worlds. Ferrus excelled at all of this. During joint operations with the Emperor's children, as we've discussed, the two legions worked together with a coordination that suggested months of training together, even when they'd only recently deployed to the same theater. This wasn't an accident. And Ferrus had developed doctrine and communication protocols specifically designed to facilitate cooperation with allied forces. He understood that even the Iron Hands, powerful as they were, would sometimes need support, and he made sure his legion could integrate seamlessly with whoever was sent to provide that support. His campaigns showed a flexibility that belied his reputation for rigid thinking. Against technologically advanced foes, he would emphasize the Iron Hands' superior equipment and Mechanicum support, overwhelming enemy positions with weapons they couldn't counter. Against numerous but poorly equipped enemies, he would use mechanized warfare to maintain mobility and prevent being bogged down in grinding infantry engagements. Against enemies that used unconventional tactics or possessed capabilities the Iron Hands couldn't directly counter, he would adapt, finding innovative solutions that played to his legion's strengths. There's a telling detail in how other legions viewed the Iron Hands. They were considered reliable, not flashy like the Emperor's children, not terrifying like the Night Lords, not mysterious like the Alpha Legion, just utterly, completely reliable. If you were assigned to a campaign with the Iron Hands, you knew exactly what you were getting. They would arrive on time, fully equipped, with clear objectives and the will to see them through. They would do what they said they would do, when they said they would do it, with the level of force necessary to ensure success. This reliability extended to Ferrus himself. When he gave his word, but he kept it. When he committed to a course of action, he saw it through. When he made an assessment of what a campaign would require, that assessment proved accurate more often than not. These might seem like basic expectations, but among the Primarchs, whose egos and personal quirks often complicated military operations, having a brother who was simply dependable was invaluable. The Iron Hands veteran companies, the Morlock Terminators, were considered among the finest elite units in any legion. These were the warriors who had fought alongside Ferrus since Medusa, who had absorbed his teachings most completely, who embodied the Iron Hands philosophy at its purest. When deployed, they were like a living battering ram. Nothing could stop them. Nothing could break them. They advanced with mechanical precision, weathering fire that would have broken lesser units, closing with the enemy and destroying them with methodical efficiency. Ferrus led from the front, more often than was strictly necessary for a Primarch. He could have commanded from a flagship, directing forces from a strategic vantage point, like Guilliman often did. But he chose to deploy with his warriors, to fight beside them, because he believed that leadership required personal investment. How could he ask his sons to embrace hardship if he wasn't willing to share in it? How could he demand they face every challenge without flinching if he wasn't standing right there with them? This approach earned him the absolute loyalty of his legion. The Iron Hands would follow Ferrus Manus into the teeth of hell itself without hesitation, because they knew he would be right there beside them. They had seen him fight. They had watched him face down enemies that should have been able to kill even a Primarch. They had witnessed his absolute refusal to accept defeat. And that example inspired them to heights of courage and determination they might not have reached otherwise. There's a particular incident that showcases Ferrus's tactical brilliance and his legion's capabilities. During a campaign against a particularly stubborn Orc empire or horde, as the Greenskins might call it, the Iron Hands and Salamanders were conducting joint operations to liberate a cluster of worlds that had been dominated by the Xenos. The fighting was fiercer than expected, much fiercer. The Greenskins had established themselves deeply, had built massive fortifications, and had access to enough scrap and raw materials to field armies that just kept coming. Each world in the cluster required its own extended campaign, and the casualties mounted on both sides. The Salamanders, with their emphasis on protecting human life and minimizing collateral damage, found themselves constantly frustrated by the need to balance speed with safeguarding the civilian populations. Ferrus approached it differently. He identified the key nodes of greenskin power on each world, the concentrations of leadership and resources that kept the various tribes organized and supplied. Then he directed overwhelming force at those nodes specifically, crushing them so thoroughly that the rest of the greenskin presence collapsed into disorganized bands that could be mopped up at leisure. It was efficient, effective, and resulted in faster liberation of the worlds in question. But it also resulted in high collateral damage. Civilian casualties were inevitable when you were dropping Leviathan-class siege guns on population centers that happened to house greenskin fortifications. Ferrus considered this acceptable losses necessary to achieve victory. Vulcan disagreed, and the two Primarchs apparently had some heated discussions about the appropriate balance between speed and protecting the very people they were supposed to be saving. In the end, both approaches were used, with Ferrus handling the most heavily fortified positions where speed mattered more than finesse, and Vulcan leading operations in areas where civilian populations could be more easily protected. The campaign succeeded. And it was during the celebrations afterward that Vulcan made his famous "the flesh is weak, but deeds endure" comment. Even in disagreement, even when their methods differed, the Primarchs could recognize each other's achievements and worth. This pattern repeated across dozens of campaigns. Ferrus would assess a situation with cold logic, identify the optimal path to victory, and execute it without regard for whether it made him popular or earned him accolades. He was the Emperor's hammer, and hammers don't concern themselves with the opinions of what they're striking. They simply fall with maximum force at the point where they'll do the most good. By the time the Horus heresy began, the Iron Hands had compiled a combat record that spoke for itself. They were one of the most successful legions, measured purely by numbers of compliances achieved and threats eliminated. They had developed expertise in multiple forms of warfare while maintaining their core identity as masters of mechanized assault. And they had a Primarch whose capabilities were recognized and respected throughout the Great Crusade's command structure, all of which makes what happened next even more tragic. Because Ferrus Manus, the reliable hammer, the dependable brother, the key to the dauntless few, was about to make a decision that would cost him everything. Betrayal's shadow, the final days before Istvan. The signs were there, if Ferrus had been willing to see them. But trust, once given, is a difficult thing to question. And Ferrus had given his trust to Fulgrim more completely than he had to any of his other brothers. This trust would prove to be his undoing. During the conquest of 1544, an unusual incident occurred that should have served as a warning. Eldar forces, specifically from Craftworld Ulthwé, made contact with the Imperial expedition. The Eldar aren't known for casual interactions with humanity, and when they do make contact, it's usually for very specific reasons. In this case, their leader, a Farseer, brought a prophecy, a vision of the future that concerned Ferrus Manus specifically. The Eldar told Ferrus that he would die at the hands of Fulgrim, that his brother, his friend, the one Primarch he trusted above all others, would be the instrument of his destruction. It was specific, it was detailed, and Ferrus rejected it absolutely. To understand why he dismissed the warning, you have to understand his relationship with the Eldar and with Xenos in general. Ferrus Manus was a product of the Imperial truth, the philosophy that held that humanity stood alone and needed no outside help or guidance. The Eldar were Xenos, alien, fundamentally untrustworthy. They had their own agendas, their own goals that might or might not align with humanity's interests. Why would he give any credence to a prophecy from beings who were, by definition, not to be trusted? More than that, the prophecy itself was insulting. It suggested that Fulgrim, who had stood beside him through dozens of campaigns, who had exchanged weapons with him in a gesture of eternal friendship, would betray that bond. It was unthinkable. Ferrus knew his brother. They had shared too much, fought too hard together, or pushed each other to greater heights for too many years. Whatever game the Eldar were playing, whatever manipulation they were attempting, Ferrus wanted no part of it. So he dismissed the prophecy and continued on as if it had never been spoken. But did some part of him remember those words? Did they lurk in the back of his mind? A tiny seed of doubt that he refused to acknowledge. We'll never know for certain, but given what happened later, it's hard not to wonder. The next warning came from Fulgrim himself, though Ferrus didn't recognize it as such at the time. The Phoenician had been growing more erratic, more obsessed with perfection to the exclusion of all else. His behavior had been changing in subtle ways that those who didn't know him well might not notice, but Ferrus should have seen it. But the problem was that Ferrus interpreted these changes as Fulgrim becoming more focused, more dedicated to their shared ideals. He saw his brother pushing toward greater achievement and approved of it. He didn't see the corruption creeping in. He didn't recognize that the layer blade Fulgrim, now carried at all times, was slowly poisoning his mind. He didn't understand that the pursuit of perfection had been twisted into something darker, an obsession that would accept any price, any sacrifice to achieve its goals. And because he didn't see it, he wasn't prepared for what came next. The confrontation happened aboard the Fist of Iron, Ferrus's flagship, in his private sanctuary called the Anvilarium. This wasn't just any room on the ship. It was his forge, his workshop, the place where he created the weapons and armor that equipped his legion. It was the closest thing to home that Ferrus had in the void between the stars, and Fulgrim's arrival there should have been a moment of pleasure, two craftsman brothers reuniting to share their latest works and discuss their ongoing pursuits. Instead, it became the scene of a betrayal that would echo across the millennia. Fulgrim had come with a purpose. Horus had ordered him to convert Ferrus to the traitor's cause. The War Master had been planning his rebellion carefully, and he'd identified Ferrus as a crucial piece of the puzzle. With the iron hands on his side, with Ferrus's tactical brilliance and unwavering determination added to the traitor forces, the rebellion's chances of success would increase dramatically. Horus believed that if anyone could sway Ferrus, it would be Fulgrim. After all, they were as close as brothers could be. Horus was wrong. We don't have complete accounts of the conversation that took place in the Anvilarium, but we know how it ended. Fulgrim made his pitch. He spoke of the Emperor holding humanity back, of the restrictions that prevented them from achieving their full potential. He talked about perfection being unattainable under the current system. He painted a picture of a new Imperium, one where the Primarchs could truly lead humanity to greatness without being shackled by the Emperor's outdated vision. And Ferrus responded with absolute rage. The fury that overtook him wasn't the cold anger of calculated retaliation. This was the Medusan fury, the volcanic rage that came from his very core. Fulgrim had suggested something unthinkable. He had proposed betraying the Emperor, turning against everything they had fought for, abandoning the very purpose for which they had been created. And he had done so casually, as if it were a reasonable suggestion, as if Ferrus might actually consider it. Ferrus attacked. The duel that followed was brief but brutal. Two Primarchs, created to be the ultimate warriors, fought in close quarters with the savage intensity that only betrayal could provoke. Ferrus wielded Forgebreaker, the thunder hammer that Fulgrim had crafted for him. The irony of using that weapon against its creator wasn't lost on either of them. He swung it with all the fury he could channel, each blow powerful enough to cave in ceramite, to shatter bone, to kill even a being as resilient as a Primarch, while Fulgrim defended himself with Fireblade, the sword Ferrus had made for him. The blade that had been forged as a symbol of their friendship now served to parry the hammer that represented that same bond. The weapons that had been created in mutual respect were now wielded in rage and desperation. During the fight, Fireblade shattered. Ferrus's living metal hands, those appendages that could shape molten metal like clay, caught the blade and simply crushed it. The power sword that had been declared worthy of legendary heroes broke in his grip, reduced to fragments. The symbolism was overwhelming. The friendship that the weapons represented was as broken as the blade itself. But Fulgrim wasn't fighting alone. The demon in the layer blade was whispering to him, feeding him strength, pushing him to kill his brother. Because that's what the daemon wanted, what chaos wanted. The corruption of Fulgrim wasn't enough. The death of Ferrus Manus would be a blow to the Imperium's chances, a removal of one of its most capable defenders. The demon urged Fulgrim to strike the killing blow, to take Forgebreaker and cave in Ferrus's skull, end him, destroy the Gorgon before he could become a threat to Horus's plans. But Fulgrim couldn't do it. Despite the corruption eating away at his soul, despite the demon's urgings, despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to kill Ferrus Manus. The friendship meant too much. The bond ran too deep. Instead, he did something arguably worse. He knocked Ferrus unconscious with Forgebreaker, the hammer that Fulgrim himself had created. As Ferrus lay there, stunned but alive, Fulgrim made his choice. He took Forgebreaker. Yet the weapon that represented his greatest work, the hammer he'd given to his closest brother as a symbol of eternal friendship, he stole it. He left Fireblade behind, the broken remnants of the sword Ferrus had made for him. Then he gave the signal to his Phoenix Guard, who had been waiting outside the Anvilarium. They burst in and executed every one of Ferrus's Morlock Terminators who had served as his honor guard. These were veterans who had fought beside the Gorgon since the early days of the Crusade, warriors who had earned their place through countless battles. They were cut down without warning, without a chance to defend themselves, by warriors they had considered brothers. Fulgrim fled the ship on his personal assault craft, the Firebird. As he escaped, he gave orders for his warships to open fire on the Iron Hand's fleet, while the surprise attack crippled several ships and provided the distraction necessary for the Emperor's children to escape into the warp. Ferrus awoke to find his honor guard dead, his ship damaged, his fleet in disarray, and his closest brother revealed as a traitor. The Eldar prophecy, which he had rejected so completely, had proven true in the cruelest way possible. Fulgrim hadn't killed him yet, but the betrayal was complete. The rage that consumed Ferrus in that moment must have been beyond description. Not just anger at being attacked, though that was certainly part of it, but the deeper fury that comes from having trust violated, from having a friendship weaponized against you, from realizing that while you were loyal to a brother, That brother was preparing to stab you in the back. This rage, this absolute fury at betrayal, would drive Ferrus's actions in the weeks that followed, and it would lead him to make decisions that, while understandable, would prove catastrophic not just for him, but for the entire Iron Hands Legion and the broader loyalist cause. When word of Horus's rebellion reached the wider Imperium, when the scale of the betrayal became clear, Ferrus Manus was among the first to respond. He didn't wait for orders from Terra. He didn't coordinate with other loyal Primarchs to develop a comprehensive strategy. He gathered his fastest ships, loaded them with his most veteran warriors, and headed for the Istvan system with one goal in mind: vengeance. He would make Fulgrim pay for his betrayal. He would make Horus pay for corrupting his brother. And he would make them all pay for thinking that they could stand against the Emperor's will and survive the experience. Ferrus Manus, the reliable hammer, the dependable brother, the cold logician who always calculated the optimal course of action, was now driven by emotion, by rage, by the need to personally ensure that the traitors faced justice. This was exactly what Horus had been counting on: the drop site massacre. The day the Imperium broke. The Istvan system sits on the border between the Segmentum Obscurus and the rest of the galaxy, near enough to the Eye of Terror that astropaths sometimes report troubled dreams when translating in-system. It's not a particularly important system strategically, not a major hub of commerce or industry. Before the heresy, most Imperial citizens would never have heard of it. And after the events that transpired there, it would become synonymous with betrayal and tragedy. When news of Horus's rebellion reached Terra, the initial response was disbelief. The War Master? The Emperor's favorite son, the one who had been placed above all his brothers? Impossible. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding, but the evidence was overwhelming. The virus bombing of Istvan III, the murder of loyalist elements within the traitor legions, the open declaration of rebellion. Horus had turned, and he had convinced others to turn with him. The Emperor's response, coordinated through Rogel Dawn, who had been left in command of Terra, was to send overwhelming force. 7 full Space Marine legions were ordered to converge on the Istvan system and destroy the rebels, the Iron Hands, Salamanders. And Raven Guard would form the first wave, with the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion following as reinforcements. It should have been enough. 3 legions in the first wave, 4 in the second, against Horus's forces which intelligence suggested were already depleted from the fighting on Istvan III. The math was simple. The rebels would be crushed between the hammer of the first wave and the anvil of the second. Horus would be brought to justice. The rebellion would end before it could truly begin. But intelligence was wrong. Horribly, catastrophically wrong. Because 4 of those 7 legions, the ones designated as the second wave, had already pledged themselves to Horus. The Night Lords under Conrad Kurz, the Iron Warriors under Perturabo, the Word-Bearers under Lorgar, and the Alpha Legion under Alfarius, all had already turned traitor. They weren't coming as reinforcements. They were coming as executioners. But the first wave didn't know this. How could they? The security around Horus's conspiracy was absolute. The Primarchs involved had hidden their true allegiances, even from their own brothers. So Ferrus Manus, Vulcan, and Corvus Corax planned their assault in good faith, believing that they had the backing of 4 more legions and that victory was all but assured. The tactical situation on Istvan V was difficult. Horus had chosen his ground well. The Urgal Depression was a volcanic valley, a natural fortress surrounded by treacherous terrain that channeled attackers into kill zones. The traitors had fortified it extensively, building defensive networks that leveraged the terrain's natural advantages. Void shields protected key positions from orbital bombardment. Fields of mines and automated weapons systems created overlapping zones of death. A frontal assault against such fortifications would be costly even for Space Marines. But Ferrus had something that made him confident: knowledge that reinforcements were mere hours away. All they needed to do was engage the traitors, pin them in place, and hold until the second wave arrived. Then it would be overwhelming force against entrenched defenders, and no fortification could withstand 7 legions acting in concert. The 3 Primarchs held a council of war aboard the Ferrum, Ferrus's flagship, at 242 hours before the planned assault. Corvus Corax, the Raven Guard's Primarch, advocated for caution. His legions specialized in stealth and precision strikes. He suggested they wait for the reinforcements, use the time to conduct thorough reconnaissance, identify weak points in the traitor defenses, and then strike with overwhelming force at multiple, carefully selected targets. Vulcan supported this approach, though for different reasons. The Salamander's Primarch was concerned about civilian casualties and collateral damage. A hasty assault would inevitably result in civilian deaths, and he wanted time to plan operations that would minimize harm to the very people they were supposed to be protecting. But Ferrus overruled them both. You have to understand his mindset in this moment. He was consumed by rage at Fulgrim's betrayal. He had come to Istvan burning with the need to make the traitors pay for their crimes, and he knew, was with the absolute certainty that came from decades of military experience, that every hour they waited was an hour the traitors could use to further strengthen their defenses. More than that, though, there was something else driving him. Something that his brothers might not have fully appreciated. Ferrus had been personally approached by Fulgrim, had been offered the chance to join the rebellion, and had violently refused. In the eyes of those who didn't know the full story, this might have raised questions. Why had Fulgrim approached Ferrus specifically? Did the Phoenician see something in the Gorgon that suggested he might be susceptible to corruption? Was there weakness there that needed to be tested? Ferrus knew these questions would be asked. He knew that his refusal, his loyalty, that needed to be demonstrated beyond any possible doubt. And the best way to prove that loyalty was to be at the forefront of crushing the rebellion, not hanging back in orbit while others bled, not cautiously reconnoitering while the traitors prepared, but leading from the front, striking hard and fast, showing everyone that Ferrus Manus would rather die than see the Emperor's enemies unpunished. So he convinced his brothers. Or perhaps convinced is too strong a word. He was the overall commander, the most senior Primarch present, and he made the decision to attack immediately. Corax and Vulcan could follow or not, but the Iron Hands were going in. Faced with this ultimatum, what choice did they have? To refuse would mean letting the Iron Hands assault alone, without support, probably resulting in catastrophic casualties. While Corax and Vulcan agreed to the immediate attack, though both harbored serious reservations, the first wave launched. Thousands of drop pods screamed through Istvan V's atmosphere. Stormbirds and thunderhawks followed, carrying additional troops and heavy weapons. The Iron Hands hit the center of the traitor lines. The Salamanders took the left flank. The Raven Guard swept right. It was a textbook, 3-pronged assault, designed to pressure the entire enemy line simultaneously and prevent the defenders from concentrating their forces against any single point. The landing was brutal. The traitors had known exactly where the loyalists would drop, thanks to reconnaissance that had gone undetected, and their defensive fire was devastating. Drop pods were destroyed in the air. Stormbirds exploded before they could deploy their troops. What the loyalists who did make it to the ground found themselves immediately engaged by prepared defenders who knew the terrain intimately. But they were Space Marines. More than that, they were some of the most veteran warriors in the entire Legiones Astartes. They pushed through the killing fields, weathered the storm of fire, closed with their enemies, and showed why even traitor Marines feared loyalist wrath. The Iron Hands, with Ferrus at their head and 10 full companies of Morlock Terminators forming the spearhead, punched through the traitor lines like a lance through flesh. Ferrus himself was a force of nature, wielding Forgebreaker, the hammer that Fulgrim had stolen from him and that he had reclaimed through means lost to history. He smashed through everything in his path. Traitor Marines, fortifications, armored vehicles. Nothing could stand against a Primarch's wrath, channeled through a weapon that could shatter mountains. The traitors fell back, not in rout, but in what appeared to be tactical withdrawal. They gave ground grudgingly, selling every meter in blood, but they did give ground. To the Loyalists, it looked like the plan was working. The assault was succeeding. The traitors were being pushed back toward their stronghold. When the second wave arrived, they would have no room to maneuver, no space to escape. They would be crushed. But then Corvus Corax made his move. The Raven Guard, masters of rapid assault, launched a massive jump pack attack at the traitor right flank. Hundreds of warriors took to the air, supported by land speeders and attack bikes, smashing into the Emperor's children positions in a thunderous assault that should have shattered the traitor line. Instead, they ran into an ambush. Angron and his World Eaters had been waiting, concealed in positions that the Raven Guard's reconnaissance had somehow missed. The Berserkers erupted from hiding, shooting Raven Guard out of the sky, destroying their speeders and tearing into the assault troops with chain axes and manic fury. The Raven Guard advance stalled and then broke as an avalanche of rock and debris triggered by the fighting buried entire squads of Loyalists. Still, the assault continued. The Loyalists had suffered heavier casualties than planned, but they were making progress. They were pushing the traitors back. Victory seemed within grasp. And then the sky filled with thunderhawks and stormbirds bearing the colors of the Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion. The reinforcements had arrived. For a moment, the Loyalists must have felt relief. Now the traitors were truly doomed. Now the hammer would fall and crush them utterly. Commands went out to consolidate positions, to prepare for the final coordinated assault that would break the traitor forces once and for all. Then the second wave opened fire. Not on the traitors, on the Loyalists. Imagine the moment. You're a space marine, fighting for your emperor, for everything you believe in. You've just weathered a devastating assault, watched brothers die around you, pushed through enemy fire to gain ground against the rebels, and then your allies, warriors who you expected to support you, who you thought were on your side, turn their guns on you from behind. The massacre that followed was as efficient as it was horrifying. The second wave's legions were fresh, fully supplied, unbloodied by battle. They poured fire into the Loyalist forces from positions of complete tactical advantage. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard were caught between enemies on two sides, exhausted from their assault, low on ammunition, with their formations disrupted by the fighting. The traitors who had been falling back reversed course and counterattacked. What had appeared to be a retreat revealed itself as a carefully planned tactical withdrawal, designed to draw the Loyalists deeper into a killing ground. Now those Loyalists found themselves in a vice, squeezed between the hammer of the newly arrived traitors and the anvil of Horus's forces. Ferrus Manus, deep in the traitor lines at the head of his Morlocks, looked around and understood what was happening. Not immediately, perhaps. The mind rebels against such complete betrayal, such total treachery. But as he saw the scale of the fire coming from behind the Loyalist lines, saw Thunderhawks bearing Night Lords, colors strafing Salamanders' positions, watched Iron Warriors' artillery pulverizing Raven Guard's strongpoints, the truth became inescapable. They had been betrayed, all of them. The entire operation had been a trap from the beginning, and looking across the battlefield, through the smoke and fire and chaos, Ferrus saw him, Fulgrim, standing on a prominent rise surrounded by his Phoenix Guard, watching the slaughter with an expression that might have been satisfaction, or might have been anguish. It was impossible to tell at such distance, but Ferrus knew what he had to do. Forget the broader tactical situation. Forget the fact that his legion was dying around him. Forget everything except the one truth that mattered. Fulgrim had betrayed him, had betrayed the Emperor, had led them all into this trap. And Ferrus Manus would make him pay for it, even if it cost him his life. He charged. The Morlocks followed, because that's what they did. Where their Primarch led, they followed. Through the thickest enemy fire, through positions that should have been impassable, they carved a path toward Fulgrim. Ferrus was unstoppable. He smashed through enemy lines with Forgebreaker, each swing of the Thunderhammer pulverizing ceramite and bone. His Morlocks fought with a fury born of betrayal, cutting down traitor marines who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Fulgrim watched him come. The Phoenician's smile, that fixed expression he'd worn since the corruption took hold, faltered as he truly understood the depth of hatred in Ferrus's eyes. This wasn't just a battle between two Primarchs. This was personal. This was a friendship murdered and a debt that would be paid in blood. The Phoenix Guard moved to intercept, but they were swept aside. Nothing could stand between Ferrus and his target. Nothing would prevent this confrontation. The Morlocks engaged Fulgrim's bodyguard in a brutal melee, lightning claws against power halberds, a veteran against veteran in combat that would have been worthy of remembrance in any other battle. But all of it was backdrop to the main event. Ferrus and Fulgrim, facing each other across a few meters of blood-soaked ground, weapons ready, knowing that one of them wouldn't walk away. Fulgrim tried to speak, tried to explain, to justify, to make Ferrus understand why this was all necessary. But Ferrus wasn't interested in explanations. He was done listening to lies from a brother who had proven himself unworthy of trust. Ferrus wielded Fireblade, which he had somehow recovered and repaired, the sword glowing with forge heat in his hands. Fulgrim held Forgebreaker, the hammer he'd stolen, along with the Layer Blade at his side. Their weapons had been forged in brotherhood, but would now be wielded in vengeance. The symbolism couldn't have been more perfect or more tragic. They clashed. Two Primarchs, genetically engineered demigods, fought with a fury that dwarfed the battle raging around them. The weapons that had been created as symbols of friendship became instruments of attempted fratricide. Ferrus swung Fireblade in burning arcs, each slash hot enough to melt ceramite. Fulgrim parried with Forgebreaker, the hammer's head, meeting the sword in explosions of energy and sparks. They traded blows, wounded each other, pushed themselves beyond the limits that would have killed lesser beings. Ferrus's armor was blackened and cracked. Fulgrim bled from a dozen wounds, but neither would yield. Neither could yield. This fight would only end when one of them was dead. Then Fulgrim revealed his final treachery. He drew the Layer Blade. Ferrus, exhausted from the battle and the duel, didn't react quickly enough. The demonic sword, empowered by the entity within it, struck with impossible speed. It bit deep into Ferrus's breastplate, finding a gap in his armor, cutting through even a Primarch's enhanced flesh. Ferrus staggered, dropped Fireblade, fell to his knees, and Fulgrim had a moment of clarity. He saw what he was doing, saw the demon's influence over him, saw the horror of what he was about to complete. He tried to stop himself, tried to pull back the blow that would kill his closest brother. But the demon was in control now. Fulgrim's body moved without his conscious will. The Layer Blade rose, and with a single strike, it severed Ferrus Manus's head from his shoulders. The first loyal Primarch to fall in the Horus heresy died not in glorious battle against impossible odds, but murdered by his closest friend, betrayed by the brother he had trusted above all others. The shockwave of Ferrus's death rippled across the battlefield. The Morlocks, seeing their Primarch fall, fought with even greater fury, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. One by one, they fell, dying to the last warrior in a futile attempt to avenge their father. The rest of the Iron Hands, already being slaughtered by the combined traitor forces, fought on with mechanical precision even as hope died. They inflicted terrible casualties, made the traitors pay for every meter of ground, but the outcome was never in doubt. 92% of the Iron Hands died on Istvan V. The Salamanders lost 96% of their forces. The Raven Guard lost 92%. 3 legions, among the most powerful military formations in the galaxy, were effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. Corvus Corax survived, barely, extracted by the few Raven Guard who managed to escape the slaughter. Vulcan's fate was unclear. He was last seen in an explosion that should have killed him, but his body was never recovered. And Ferrus? Fulgrim, in his demon-possessed state, took the Gorgon's head and delivered it to Horus as a trophy. When news of the disaster reached Terra, it sent shockwaves through the Imperium that would never fully dissipate. A loyal Primarch dead, 2 others missing or critically wounded, 3 legions shattered, the path to terror wide open, the scale of the betrayal beyond anything anyone had imagined. And Reboot Guilliman, when he heard that Ferrus had fallen along with Vulcan and Corax, said that of the 3, he would miss Ferrus most of all. Because Ferrus had been the key, the dependable one, the brother whose capabilities could have turned the tide of what was coming. And now he was gone, killed, before he could reach his full potential, before his true value to the loyalist cause could be fully realized. Istvan V didn't just rob the Imperium of a Primarch and 3 legions. It robbed the loyalists of hope. It showed that even the Emperor's chosen sons could be corrupted, that even brotherhood could be weaponized, that even the most reliable and dependable could be brought low by the right combination of rage and treachery. The Horus heresy had truly begun, and the Imperium would never be the same. But the shattered legacy, how his sons misunderstood everything. In the aftermath of Istvan V, the survivors of the Iron Hands faced a choice. They could accept their catastrophic defeat, mourn their fallen Primarch, and fall back to regroup and rebuild. Or they could do something else, something darker, something that would define them for the next 10,000 years. They chose vengeance. The remnants of the Iron Hands, along with survivors from the Salamanders and Raven Guard, formed what became known as the Shattered Legions. These were warriors consumed by rage and grief, operating independently of the broader Imperial command structure, launching guerrilla strikes against traitor forces wherever they could be found. They were effective, brutal, and utterly merciless. But the Iron Hands contingent took it further. But they didn't just seek vengeance against the traitors who had killed their Primarch. They sought to become more like Ferrus had been, or at least, more like they thought he had been. And in their grief-stricken state, traumatized by witnessing their father's death and the near annihilation of their legion, they made a catastrophic error of interpretation. They looked at Ferrus Manus's teachings about strength and weakness, about constant improvement and the rejection of limitations. They looked at his living metal hands, the necrodermis that had given him such incredible power. They looked at their own weakness, their failure to save him, their inability to prevent the disaster at Istvan, and they concluded that flesh had been their downfall. That organic tissue, with its limitations and vulnerabilities, but was the weakness that needed to be purged. So they began to replace themselves, systematically, deliberately. They cut away their flesh and replaced it with bionics. They embraced augmentation not as a necessity for those wounded beyond the apothecary's ability to heal, but as an ideal to be pursued. The more of yourself you replaced with machine components, the stronger you became. The closer you got to being pure mechanism, the better you served the Emperor. This wasn't what Ferrus wanted. We know this because of the Nymeral Scrolls, those passages where he explicitly stated his intentions to have his legion recant their distrust of flesh when the fighting was done. But the fighting was never done, and Ferrus never got the chance to correct his son's misunderstanding. More tragically, as the Iron Hands began to see their failure at Istvan as a moral failing rather than a tactical one. They blamed themselves for letting Ferrus die. They looked for character flaws, for weaknesses in their own natures that could explain such a catastrophic outcome. And in their search for explanations, they decided that emotion was the culprit. If Ferrus hadn't been driven by rage at Fulgrim's betrayal, they reasoned, he might not have rushed into the assault. If they had been more cold, more logical, more mechanical in their thinking, maybe they could have seen the trap before it was sprung. The conclusion they reached was that emotion itself was weakness, that the capacity to feel was a flaw to be overcome. So they purged themselves of feeling, or at least they tried to. They suppressed their emotions behind walls of iron discipline. They rejected attachment, friendship, camaraderie, all the bonds that made them human. They became calculating, cold, mechanical in their approach to warfare and to life itself. The modern Iron Hands, the chapter that exists in the 41st Millennium, is the endpoint of this tragic evolution. Every brother who joins the chapter undergoes the ritual replacement of their left hand with a bionic version, mimicking Ferrus's silver hands, but completely missing the point. It's meant to honor their Primarch, but Ferrus would have hated it. He never wanted his sons to cut pieces of themselves away. He wanted them to be strong enough to overcome their limitations without losing their humanity in the process. But there's an even darker twist to this story. The psychic backlash of Ferrus's death spawned something terrible. When a Primarch dies, especially one killed in such a brutal and emotionally charged manner, it sends ripples through the warp. Ferrus's death created a demon, a creature born from his frustrated pride, his boiling anger, his shame at having been killed before fulfilling his purpose. This entity became known as the Sapphire King. The Sapphire King has haunted the Iron Hands across the centuries. It feeds on their repressed emotions, their chained desperation, their suppressed humanity. Every time they reject their feelings, every time they replace flesh with steel, every time they choose cold logic over human connection, they strengthen this demon. It offers them opportunities disguised as strength, nudges them toward ever greater rejection of what makes them human, and forever seeking to push them into damnation while convincing them they're pursuing salvation. The demon's greatest triumph might be how completely invisible it remains. The Iron Hands don't know it exists. They think their increasing mechanization, their growing inhumanity, is making them stronger. They don't realize they're playing into the hands of a warp entity born from their Primarch's death, feeding it with every augmentation, every suppressed emotion, every step further away from the humanity Ferrus wanted them to preserve. There's a horrible irony in how the "flesh is weak" mantra has been misunderstood. Vulcan's original meaning, that even Primarchs can tire, but their deeds outlast their mortal limitations, has been twisted into something Ferrus never intended. As the modern Iron Hands chant it as justification for their self-mutilation, their rejection of organic tissue in favor of mechanical replacements. But there's a story that reveals the tragedy of this misunderstanding. A Salamander's captain named Arii, during a joint operation with the Iron Hands, heard them use this phrase and corrected them. He explained that what they were saying, "the flesh is weak," was only half the saying. The complete phrase was, "the flesh is weak, but deeds endure." It was a message of humility, not condemnation. A reminder that physical bodies are temporary, but the legacy of what you accomplish transcends those limitations. The Iron Hands captain he was speaking to dismissed this explanation. Their legion had adopted the truncated version as doctrine, and no amount of evidence that they'd misunderstood would sway them. They had built their entire identity around this misinterpretation, and admitting they were wrong would mean confronting the possibility that everything they'd become since Istvan was based on a fundamental mistake. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all is that Ferrus himself had planned to address this exact issue. He knew his sons were taking his teachings too far, were developing an unhealthy obsession with replacing their flesh. He had intended, once the Great Crusade was complete, to strip the living metal from his own hands as an example, to show them that the necrodermis, powerful as it was something he was willing to give up because he understood that depending on it too much was its own kind of weakness. But he died before he could do this. He had died before he could correct the course his legion was taking. And his sons, left without his guidance, interpreted his death as evidence that they needed to go even further down the path he had wanted to pull them away from. The modern Iron Hands are notorious among other chapters for their coldness, their lack of compassion, their mechanical approach to everything. They view themselves as superior because of their augmentations, seeing flesh and blood space marines as inferior, as still shackled by weaknesses they've transcended. They're effective, certainly. They're ruthless and efficient and technically proficient. But they've lost something essential in the process. They've lost their humanity, the very thing Ferrus was trying to preserve through his philosophy of tempering weakness rather than cutting it away. They've abandoned. And they did it in his name, thinking they were honoring him, when in reality, they were betraying everything he actually believed. There's a particular bitterness in how they view the other shattered legions. The Iron Hands harbor special hatred for the Salamanders and Raven Guard successor chapters. They blame them for not fighting hard enough at Istvan, for retreating rather than dying to the last warrior. They believe that if those legions had been stronger, if they had refused to break no matter the cost, Ferrus might have survived. This belief defies all logic and all evidence. The Salamanders and Raven Guard were massacred just as thoroughly as the Iron Hands. Their survival had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with tactical necessity. Corvus Corax recognized that staying on Istvan would mean the complete annihilation of all three legions, and he made the hard choice to save what he could, rather than throw away lives for no purpose. But the Iron Hands can't accept this, can't accept that retreat was the right call, because accepting it would mean acknowledging that pure stubbornness and refusal to yield isn't always the answer. It would mean recognizing that sometimes the strong choice is to survive and fight another day, rather than dying gloriously but uselessly. This 10,000-year grudge has led to situations where the Iron Hands have refused to aid Salamanders or Raven Guard's successor chapters in desperate need, where they've withheld intelligence or resources that could have prevented disasters, all because of a bitter resentment based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened at Istvan. Guilliman's lament that he would miss Ferrus most of all takes on additional meaning when you consider how the Iron Hands developed. He recognized that Ferrus, with his combination of strategic brilliance and tactical flexibility, with his ability to adapt and overcome any challenge, would have been essential to the Loyalist cause during the heresy and its aftermath. Instead, the Imperium got a legion so traumatized by their Primarch's death that they became a twisted reflection of what he'd wanted them to be. There have been attempts, across the millennia, to course correct. Some Iron Hands leaders have recognized that their chapter's path might not be what Ferrus intended. Cardan Stronos, a chapter master in more recent times, has apparently begun to understand that logic alone cannot prevail, that the Iron Hands need to hold on to the traits that make them human, even if those traits are expressed through their closeness with machines. But these reformers face fierce resistance from the more conservative elements of the chapter, from those who have built their entire identity around the doctrine of flesh as weakness. Changing such deeply ingrained beliefs, especially when they're wrapped up in the memory of a dead Primarch, is nearly impossible. The saddest part of all this is that Ferrus Manus, if he could see what his sons have become, would be horrified. The cold, mechanical, emotionless warriors they've turned themselves into are the antithesis of what he wanted. He valued improvement, yes, but not at the cost of humanity. He wanted his sons to be strong, but he also wanted them to remain human, to preserve the capacity for feeling and connection that made them more than just weapons. His legacy has been twisted into its opposite. His teachings have been perverted into justification for exactly the kind of weakness he was warning against, the weakness of depending too heavily on mechanical augmentation instead of tempering and strengthening the flesh and spirit together. And through it all, the Sapphire King watches and waits, feeding on their repressed emotions, growing stronger with every bionic implant, every suppressed feeling, every step the Iron Hands take toward becoming the soulless machines they think Ferrus wanted them to be. The underrated genius. Why Ferrus matters. So we come to the heart of the question, why is Ferrus Manus so underrated? And why should he be recognized as one of the most significant Primarchs despite his early death? The answer lies in potential. In what could have been, if not for a series of tragic choices and betrayals that cut his story short before he could demonstrate his full capabilities. Let's start with his strategic mind. Ferrus Manus was, by all accounts, one of the most tactically brilliant Primarchs. Guilliman, himself a master strategist, recognized this and included Ferrus among the dauntless few, specifically noting him as the key. That's not faint praise. That's the avenging son, the architect of the Codex Astartes, saying that this particular brother was essential to the Emperor's grand design. Why was Ferrus the key? Because he combined qualities that were rare even among Primarchs. His strategic vision paired with tactical flexibility, technical mastery, combined with practical application, the ability to see the big picture without losing sight of crucial details. He could plan campaigns on the scale of entire sectors while also understanding the minutiae of individual unit deployment. He could design weapons and armor while also developing the doctrines for how to use them most effectively. This versatility made him invaluable. Where other Primarchs might excel in one particular type of warfare or strategic situation, Ferrus could adapt to anything. Siege warfare. He had the technical knowledge and the mechanized forces. Rapid assault. He could coordinate that too. Long grinding campaigns. His legion's discipline and determination made them perfect for it. Guerrilla operations. His understanding of logistics and supply lines meant he could interdict enemy operations with devastating efficiency. Now consider the what-ifs. What if Ferrus had survived Istvan? The shattered legions, instead of being a collection of traumatized survivors operating independently, could have been welded into a unified guerrilla force under coherent leadership. Ferrus's strategic brilliance, combined with Korax's stealth expertise and Vulcan's craftsmanship and compassion, could have created an insurgent army that struck at the traitors' supply lines and rear areas with devastating effect. What if Ferrus had been present during the Shadow Crusade, when Lorgar and Angron rampaged through Ultramar? His tactical acumen and technical expertise could have provided solutions to problems that stumped other Loyalist commanders. His refusal to accept defeat might have rallied Loyalist forces at crucial moments when despair threatened to overwhelm them. What if he'd been at Terra for the final siege? Another Primarch of his caliber on the walls, another genius-level strategic mind helping coordinate the defense, might have changed key moments in the battle. It's impossible to say for certain, but given how close-run several crucial engagements were, having Ferrus's capabilities available could have tipped the balance. But beyond tactical considerations, Ferrus represented something important philosophically. He embodied the Emperor's vision of humanity improved, but not transformed beyond recognition. He believed in making humans stronger, better, more capable of surviving in a hostile galaxy, but without losing the essential qualities that made them human. This is crucial because it represented a middle path between the extremes that would tear the Imperium apart. On one side, you had Primarchs like Lorgar, who wanted to elevate humanity through worship and faith, who saw the human condition as something to transcend through spiritual means. On the other, you had those like the later Ferrus-influenced Iron Hands, who would seek to transcend humanity through mechanical augmentation. Ferrus himself walked a line between these extremes. He understood that humans had limitations, but he believed those limitations could be overcome through discipline, training, and yes, judicious use of technology, without abandoning humanity in the process. This philosophical position might have provided a moderating influence during crucial debates about the Imperium's future. Yet when the question arose of how much humanity should be modified, enhanced, or replaced in the pursuit of survival, Ferrus's voice advocating for improvement without transformation could have shaped policy in ways that avoided some of the grimdark extremes the Imperium eventually embraced. His relationship with the Mechanicum is another underappreciated aspect of his significance. Ferrus had closer ties to Mars than almost any other Primarch, save perhaps Horus, in his role as War Master. The tech priests respected Ferrus not just as a military leader, but as a fellow craftsman, someone who understood the sacred mysteries of the machine on a fundamental level. His living metal hands, his intuitive grasp of technology, his ability to create works that inspired awe even in those who had studied the mechanical arts for centuries. All of this gave him unique standing with the Mechanicum. If Ferrus had survived, he could have potentially prevented or mitigated the schism of Mars. When Horus convinced Kelbohal to turn significant portions of the Mechanicum traitor, it was partly because there wasn't a strong enough loyalist voice with the technical credibility to counter the War Master's arguments. Ferrus could have been that voice. His expertise, combined with his undisputed loyalty to the Emperor, might have kept more of the Mechanicum on the loyalist side. The loss of this potential influence cascades through the rest of the heresy and beyond. How much of the Imperium's technological stagnation in the 10,000 years since the heresy can be traced back to the loss of knowledge during the schism of Mars? How many Forge worlds fell to chaos that might have remained loyal if Ferrus had been there to argue the case for the Emperor? How much of the Dark Mechanicum's strength comes from resources and expertise that could have been denied to them? We can't know for certain, but the potential is staggering. There's also the matter of his influence on his brothers. Ferrus had a friendship with Fulgrim that was considered one of the strongest bonds in the Primarch Brotherhood. What other relationships might he have developed given time? What counsel might he have provided to brothers struggling with their own demons? Consider Magnus the Red. Magnus's tragedy came partly from isolation, from not having brothers who understood his pursuit of knowledge and power. Ferrus, with his own quest for perfection through mastery of craft, might have been able to relate to Magnus in ways others couldn't. He might have provided a grounding influence, a reminder that the pursuit of power should serve humanity rather than becoming an end unto itself. Or consider Mortarion, whose bitterness about his upbringing and his relationship with the Emperor poisoned his perspective. Ferrus, who had tested himself against the Emperor and accepted his father's authority without reservation, might have been able to help Mortarion work through his resentment before it became corrupting. Or even Perturabo, whose similarities to Ferrus were surface deep, but whose divergent paths revealed crucial differences in character. Ferrus might have been able to show Perturabo that strength didn't require bitterness, that you could be effective without being resentful, that duty could be its own reward. These are all speculation, of course, might-have-beens and what-ifs, but they illustrate the point. Ferrus Manus was positioned to be a crucial figure in the Primarch Brotherhood, someone whose influence could have shaped events in ways we can barely imagine. His death removed that potential, left gaps that other Primarchs couldn't fill. And perhaps most importantly, Ferrus represented a certain kind of nobility that the Imperium desperately needed. He was loyal without being blind. He was strong without being cruel. He pursued perfection without descending into obsession. He led from the front without seeking glory. He created beauty without losing sight of function. He believed in improvement without advocating for the abandonment of humanity. In a galaxy increasingly defined by extremes, Ferrus was a voice for the middle way, for the idea that you could be strong and compassionate, effective and humane, powerful and wise. His loss deprived the Imperium of this moderating influence at exactly the moment when it was needed most. The tragedy is compounded when you consider how young he was, relatively speaking, when he died. Primarchs don't age like normal humans, and Ferrus had barely scratched the surface of his potential. He'd been leading his legion for a few decades. Compare that to the 10,000 years that Guilliman has had to refine his strategies and implement his visions. Imagine what Ferrus could have accomplished with even a fraction of that time. His craftsmanship would have continued to improve. His tactical genius would have been honed by more campaigns. His strategic vision would have expanded. His understanding of how to balance strength with humanity would have deepened. He could have become the greatest military leader the Imperium ever produced, the Primarch whose combination of abilities made him invaluable in any situation. Instead, he's remembered primarily as the first loyal Primarch to die, the one who fell for a trap, the warrior whose rage overrode his judgment. These characterizations aren't entirely wrong, but they're painfully incomplete. They focus on his final days, his final hours, his final moments, and ignore the decades of achievement that preceded them. When people discuss the greatest Primarchs, the conversation tends to focus on Guilliman's administrative genius, Sanguinius's inspiration and sacrifice, Dawn's fortitude, the Lion's tactical brilliance. Ferrus rarely gets mentioned in the same breath. That he's the forgotten Primarch, the one whose story ended too soon for him to be properly appreciated. But that underappreciation is itself unjust. Ferrus Manus deserves to be remembered not just for how he died, but for what he accomplished, what he represented, and what he could have become. He deserves to be recognized as one of the dauntless few, as the key that Guilliman identified, as a Primarch whose loss was felt more keenly than many realize. The fact that his sons misunderstood his legacy so completely makes this even more important. Because the modern Iron Hands don't honor Ferrus Manus. They honor a distorted reflection of him, a twisted interpretation of his teachings that he would have rejected. If we don't understand who Ferrus really was, if we don't appreciate what he truly believed, sure, then his actual legacy disappears entirely, replaced by the mechanistic doctrine of a chapter that bears his name but has lost his spirit. Understanding Ferrus Manus, truly understanding him, requires looking past the surface. It requires seeing beyond the living metal hands and the brutal reputation and the tragic death. It requires understanding a Primarch who believed that humanity could be improved without being abandoned, who created works of breathtaking beauty while leading one of the most effective military forces in the galaxy, who valued strength but also recognized the danger of depending too heavily on any single source of power. This is why Ferrus Manus is the most underrated Primarch in Warhammer 40,000. Not because he accomplished less than his brothers, but because what he did accomplish, what he represented, and what he could have achieved have been overshadowed by the circumstances of his death and the misinterpretation of his legacy. Myths and mysteries. Will the Gorgon return? One of the peculiar aspects of Ferrus Manus's death is how thoroughly the Iron Hands refused to accept it. Despite overwhelming evidence, despite the fact that thousands of Space Marines witnessed their Primarch's decapitation, despite the recovery of his skull, the modern Iron Hands chapter maintains the position that Ferrus might still live. This denial has spawned numerous theories, rumors, and legends about Ferrus's fate and potential return. Some of these are based on actual lore, documented events that have been twisted and expanded through 10,000 years of desperate hope. Others are pure speculation, wishful thinking, given narrative form. Let's examine the major theories and separate what we know from what we hope. The most famous theory, and the one that many Iron Hands privately cling to, is that Ferrus was somehow spirited away to Mars after the battle. The story goes that his body, or at least significant portions of it, were recovered by Mechanicum forces and taken to the Red Planet for preservation and potential restoration. There, in secret forges deep beneath Mars's surface, tech priests supposedly labor even now to resurrect the Gorgon, to restore him through some combination of bionics, cloning, and arcane technology that borders on heresy. This theory isn't entirely without basis. We know that Ferrus's skull eventually made its way to the Iron Hands, though the exact chain of custody is unclear. During the heresy, Inquisitor Kinnabad discovered evidence of a pact between Guilliman, Dawn, and the shattered Iron Hands Legion. Part of this pact involved the return of Ferrus's skull to his sons in exchange for their adherence to the nascent Codex Astartes. But if they recovered the skull, what happened to the rest of his body? The Iron Hands themselves don't know, or at least they claim not to. The skull sits on an altar in the Eye of Medusa, watched over by a Hellfather who supposedly doesn't eat, drink, sleep, or blink in his eternal vigil. But the body, its location remains a mystery that has fueled speculation for millennia. Could the Mechanicum have taken it to Mars? Possibly. They had the means and the motive. Ferrus was one of their greatest allies among the Primarchs, a figure they revered almost as much as the Omnissiah himself. And if there was any chance of restoring him, they would have pursued it. The technology exists, at least in theory. We've seen what can be done with Primarch flesh and sufficient technical expertise. The real question is whether anyone would actually attempt it, because here's the problem. Bringing Ferrus back, truly back, would require more than just rebuilding his body. Primarchs aren't just physical beings. They have a presence in the warp, a psychic component that's essential to who they are. Ferrus's death wasn't just physical, it was a severing of that warp presence, a fundamental ending that technology alone can't reverse. Unless, of course, you're willing to make certain accommodations, certain deals, certain compromises with forces that shouldn't be bargained with. And that's where this theory gets dark. Or because if the Mechanicum did try to restore Ferrus, what exactly would they be bringing back? Would it truly be the Gorgon? Or would it be something else, wearing his face? The Dark Mechanicum, the traitor tech priests who serve chaos, would certainly have interest in such a project. Imagine the propaganda value, the psychological impact of corrupting Ferrus Manus and deploying him against his own sons. It would be the ultimate desecration, the final triumph of the traitors over one of their most hated enemies. But there's no evidence this has happened. If corrupted Ferrus existed, if the Dark Mechanicum had succeeded in such an abomination, surely we would have seen him by now. The traitors would parade him across the galaxy, would use him to break the morale of every loyalist force they encountered.
The fact that this hasn't happened suggests that either the body was never recovered, or any attempts at restoration have failed. Then there's the clone theory, which has a somewhat firmer basis in established lore. We know that Fulgrim, consumed by guilt and madness over killing his brother, ordered Fabius Bile to create clones of Ferrus Manus. The chief apothecary of the Emperor's children, master of genetic manipulation and biological horror, took on this task with his characteristic enthusiasm for pushing the boundaries of what should and shouldn't be done with gene science. Bile created multiple clones over the centuries following the heresy. Each one was perfect physically, a recreation of Ferrus Manus down to the molecular level. But here's where it gets interesting. The clones didn't have the living metal hands. Those were something Ferrus acquired during his life, not something he was born with. To hide this from the clones, Fulgrim had them wear gauntlets, which confused them since the original Ferrus had never needed such protection. But the truly fascinating aspect, the detail that suggests something profound about Primarch nature, is that the clones somehow possessed Ferrus's memories. Not completely, perhaps not accurately, but they knew things they shouldn't have known, remembered events they never experienced. This suggests that Primarch consciousness exists somehow beyond simple physical form, that memories might be encoded in their genetic structure or accessible through their warp presence. Every clone, upon learning the truth of what they were, refused to join Fulgrim's cause. Every single one, when offered the chance to serve chaos, to stand with the corrupted Phoenician against the Emperor, chose loyalty instead, and everyone was killed by Fulgrim for that choice, forcing the demon Primarch to watch himself murder Ferrus again and again, each death driving him deeper into madness. This raises an interesting possibility. If clones of Ferrus inherently possess his loyalty, his refusal to compromise his principles, then creating a loyalist clone might be theoretically possible. Someone with Ferrus's memories, his capabilities, his essential nature, but without the original's death being undone. It would be a new Ferrus, not the original resurrected, but potentially close enough to matter. Of course, this would require someone having access to Ferrus's genetic material and the technical capability to perform Primarch-level cloning. The Emperor's children presumably still have samples, given Fabius Bile's ongoing experiments. The Iron Hands might have preserved genetic material from their Primarch. The Mechanicum certainly would have, if they had access to his body. But would anyone actually attempt it? The moral and practical questions are staggering. Is such a clone truly Ferrus Manus, or an abomination wearing his shape? Would the clone have a soul, a warp presence, or would it be hollow, fundamentally incomplete? And even if successful, even if you created a perfect clone with all of Ferrus's knowledge and loyalty, would the Imperium accept him? Would the Iron Hands themselves recognize such a being as their Primarch? There's also the Dreadnought theory, which some Iron Hands find particularly compelling, given their chapter's obsession with the fusion of flesh and machine. The idea is that if Ferrus's brain or some portion of his organic tissue survived his decapitation, it could potentially be installed in a Dreadnought sarcophagus. Not a standard pattern, certainly, but something custom-built to house what remained of a Primarch. This theory has a certain logic to it. The Iron Hands are masters of such technology. They have the expertise and resources to create a dreadnought chassis that could contain even a Primarch's consciousness. And thematically, it would fit their current philosophy, the ultimate expression of flesh replaced by iron, weakness excised, and strength preserved. But again, there are problems. First, we have no evidence that any of Ferrus's organic material survived beyond the skull. Second, Primarchs are fundamentally different from normal space marines. The technology that allows a wounded Astartes to survive and fight on in a dreadnought might not work for a being whose physiology is as much warpcraft as biology. Third, and perhaps most importantly, would Ferrus himself have wanted such an existence? Remember, the Ferrus who planned to strip the living metal from his hands, who intended to teach his sons to embrace their humanity rather than replace it, would likely have viewed eternal entombment in a machine as a fate worse than death. It would be the ultimate irony, the final twist of the knife, saving Ferrus in a way he would have hated, preserving him as a living contradiction of everything he believed. Some of the more esoteric theories involve the Legion of the Damned, those mysterious space marines who appear from nowhere to aid Imperial forces in their darkest hours, fight with impossible effectiveness, then vanish as mysteriously as they arrived. Some believe these are the spirits of fallen space marines, given form by the Emperor's will to continue serving even in death. Could Ferrus Manus be leading them? It's a romantic notion, the idea that the Gorgon's spirit refuses to rest, that his duty compels him to manifest from the warp and fight for the Imperium, even though his body is long dead. There are reports, scattered across 10,000 years of Imperial history, of a massive golden figure leading Legion of the Damned forces, as a warrior whose presence inspires absolute loyalty and whose combat effectiveness suggests Primarch-level capability. But these reports are fragmentary, contradictory, and impossible to verify. The Legion of the Damned don't exactly give interviews or provide documentation. They appear, they fight, they disappear. Trying to confirm whether one of them is secretly a dead Primarch is an exercise in futility. Then there are the truly wild theories, the ones that venture into realms of speculation that border on fan fiction. Some suggest that Ferrus never actually died, that what Fulgrim killed was a psychic projection or a clone, and the real Ferrus has been operating in secret for 10,000 years. Others propose that he was taken by some external force, the Eldar perhaps, or some other faction, for purposes unknown. Yet still others believe he'll return during some prophesied moment of great need, that his death was somehow not permanent, and circumstances will align to bring him back when the Imperium faces its darkest hour. These theories are, to put it mildly, unsupported by any actual evidence. They exist because the idea of Ferrus's permanent death is too painful for some to accept, because the waste of his potential seems too great to be final. Their wish fulfillment, the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, the Gorgon still lives and will return to lead his sons when they need him most. The most likely reality is the simplest and saddest. Ferrus Manus is dead and will remain dead. His body was destroyed or lost after Istvan. His skull rests on Medusa, a grim trophy and reminder of the price of betrayal. His spirit, and whatever became of it in the warp, has not, and likely will not, return to the material realm. The Primarch who could have been one of the Imperium's greatest assets is gone forever, and no amount of hope or technological wizardry will change that. But understanding why these theories persist, why the Iron Hands and many fans of the setting cling to the possibility of his return, is important. It speaks to the impact Ferrus had, the potential that was cut short, the sense that his story shouldn't have ended when it did. He deserved better than to be the first loyal Primarch to fall. He deserved the chance to demonstrate his full capabilities, to show why Guilliman considered him the key, to fulfill the potential that everyone who knew him recognized. That he was denied that chance is one of the great tragedies of the Horus heresy. That his sons have spent 10,000 years refusing to accept his death speaks to the depth of that tragedy and the profound impact his loss had on those who followed him. Whether Ferrus Manus will ever return to the setting in any form is a question only Games Workshop can answer. From a narrative perspective, there are arguments both ways. His return could provide powerful storytelling opportunities, a chance to explore how he reacts to what his sons have become, how he fits into the modern Imperium, whether he can reclaim and redirect his legacy. But his absence also serves a purpose, a permanent reminder of what was lost during the heresy, a wound that never heals. Perhaps the uncertainty itself is the point. Perhaps the fact that the Iron Hands refuse to accept his death, and that they cling to the hope of his return, despite all evidence to the contrary, tells us everything we need to know about Ferrus Manus's significance. He was a Primarch so valued, so needed, that those who knew him refused to believe he's truly gone. And maybe, in a setting where the impossible happens with disturbing regularity, where Primarchs who were thought lost forever return after 10,000 years, where the dead sometimes walk, and reality itself bends to the right combination of will and power, maybe that hope isn't entirely unfounded. But for now, Ferrus Manus remains dead. His skull sits on an altar. His sons wage eternal war in his name, while misunderstanding his teachings. And the Imperium continues on, without the steady hand, the brilliant mind, and the balanced wisdom of the Gorgon. But the lessons of the Gorgon, what we can learn from Ferrus Manus. As we reach the end of this journey through the life and legacy of Ferrus Manus, it's worth reflecting on what his story teaches us. Because beyond the tragedy, beyond the loss and the misunderstanding and the waste of potential, there are lessons here that resonate both within the Warhammer 40,000 setting and beyond it. The first and perhaps most important lesson is about the danger of misinterpreting someone's teachings after they're gone. Ferrus wanted his sons to be strong, to overcome their weaknesses, to constantly improve themselves. The Iron Hands took this teaching and twisted it into justification for cutting away their humanity, for replacing flesh with machine, for suppressing emotion in the name of cold logic. They thought they were honoring their father, or they were actually betraying everything he believed. This happens in the real world too. Leaders, teachers, philosophers die, and those who come after interpret their words through the lens of their own biases and needs. The original meaning gets lost. The teaching gets twisted. And before long, people are doing terrible things in the name of someone who would have been horrified by those actions. The lesson here is clear. When someone shares wisdom, when someone tries to teach us something important, we have a responsibility to truly understand what they mean, not just grab onto the parts that confirm what we already believe. Context matters. Intent matters. And if we're going to claim to follow someone's teachings, but we need to make sure we actually understand those teachings rather than creating a distorted version that serves our own purposes. The second lesson is about the cost of rage. Ferrus Manus was a brilliant strategist, a tactical genius whose capabilities were recognized by even his most accomplished brothers. But at Istvan, his rage at Fulgrim's betrayal overrode his judgment. He rushed into an assault that more cautious Primarchs advised against. He charged into the heart of enemy lines, seeking personal vengeance, rather than maintaining the broader strategic perspective that should have governed his actions. That decision cost him his life, nearly destroyed 3 legions, and dealt a blow to the loyalist cause from which it never fully recovered. One emotional decision, one moment of letting fury override reason, and the consequences cascaded across the entire galaxy. This isn't to say that emotion is bad or that we should all become cold, calculating machines like the modern Iron Hands. Ferrus himself would reject that conclusion. But it does remind us that our emotions, particularly our anger, need to be acknowledged and managed rather than suppressed or allowed to run rampant. Rage has its place. Sometimes righteous fury is appropriate and necessary, but it should serve our judgment, not replace it. The third lesson concerns the nature of strength and weakness. Ferrus taught that weakness should be identified and overcome through constant effort and improvement. The flesh might be weak, but deeds endure. The physical body has limitations, but the legacy of what you accomplish transcends those limitations. This is fundamentally different from the modern Iron Hand's interpretation that weakness should be cut away, that anything that makes you vulnerable should be eliminated regardless of what else you lose in the process. Ferrus's approach was about tempering, about making yourself stronger while retaining what makes you who you are. The Iron Hand's approach is about amputation, about cutting away pieces of yourself in the pursuit of invulnerability. The lesson here is that true strength doesn't come from eliminating everything that makes you vulnerable. It comes from acknowledging your vulnerabilities and working with them, around them, through them. It comes from being aware of your limitations while refusing to let those limitations define what you can achieve. Cutting away every weak point doesn't make you strong. It makes you brittle, as inflexible, unable to adapt to situations that require the very qualities you've excised. The fourth lesson is about the value of balance. Ferrus Manus walked a line between extremes. He valued technology, but didn't worship it. He believed in strength, but didn't embrace cruelty. He pursued perfection, but recognized that obsession with perfection could become its own kind of weakness. He was loyal to the Emperor without being blind to the costs of that loyalty. In a setting defined by extremes, where everything is dialed to 11 and moderation is seen as weakness, Ferrus's balanced approach stands out. He proved that you could be effective without being monstrous, that you could pursue excellence without descending into obsession, that you could be strong without being cruel. This balance is what made him so valuable, and it's also what made him underrated, because balanced, nuanced characters don't make for the most dramatic stories. The heresy is full of Primarchs who represent extremes: Angron's rage, Fulgrim's perfectionism, Lorga's faith, Mortarian's bitterness. These make for compelling narratives because they're so clearly defined, so obviously readable. Ferrus's balance makes him harder to characterize in simple terms, harder to reduce to a single defining trait. But that complexity, that refusal to be just one thing, is precisely what made him so important. The lesson here is that complexity is strength, that nuance is valuable, that sometimes the most effective approach isn't the most dramatic or extreme one. The fifth lesson concerns the importance of understanding intention. The Iron Hands look at their Primarch's living metal hands and conclude that machine is superior to flesh, but they miss the crucial context. Ferrus acquired those hands through trial and hardship, and he planned to remove them when the fighting was done. The hands were a tool, a means to an end, not an ideal to be pursued for its own sake. Understanding someone's intention, the why behind their actions, is often more important than the actions themselves. Ferrus used technology extensively, but his intention was to make humanity stronger, not to replace humanity with machines. His sons focused on the what he did and what he had, and missed the why, the reasoning and intention behind it. This happens constantly in real life. We see what people do and assume we understand why they did it, but we're often wrong. When we project our own motivations onto others, or we grab onto surface-level explanations that confirm our existing beliefs. Actually, understanding intention requires effort, empathy, and willingness to set aside our assumptions. The sixth lesson is about legacy and how it can be shaped, distorted, or destroyed by those who come after. Ferrus Manus's actual teachings and beliefs have been almost entirely lost under 10,000 years of misinterpretation by his sons. The Iron Hands think they're honoring him, but they're actually becoming the opposite of what he wanted them to be. This should make us think about our own legacies, about how our words and actions will be interpreted when we're no longer around to provide context and correction. It should make us more careful about what we say and do, more explicit about our intentions, and more aware that our example will be studied and potentially misunderstood by those who come after us. But it should also make us more careful about how we interpret the legacies of others. When we claim to follow someone's teachings or honor someone's memory, do we really understand what they believed? Or are we creating a convenient fiction that serves our purposes while dishonoring the person we claim to respect? The seventh and final lesson is perhaps the most important. Potential matters, even when it's unfulfilled. Ferrus Manus never reached his full capabilities. He died before he could demonstrate why Guilliman considered him the key to the dauntless few. He never got the chance to show what he could have become, given another few decades or centuries of growth and refinement. But that unfulfilled potential still matters, as it shapes how we view his story, how we understand his significance, how we measure the cost of his loss. The tragedy of Ferrus isn't just that he died, it's that he died before becoming everything he could have been. This applies to real life as well. People die before fulfilling their potential all the time. Talents are lost, capabilities are never fully developed, brilliance is cut short by circumstance or bad luck or tragedy. And every time it happens, the world is poorer for it. Recognizing this should make us more aware of the potential in ourselves and others. It should make us more protective of that potential, more willing to nurture and develop it, more conscious of how easily it can be lost. Every person has capabilities that might never be realized, talents that might never be developed, our contributions they could make if given the chance. Ferrus Manus's story reminds us not to waste that potential, not to let rage or pride or circumstance prevent us or others from becoming everything we could be, not to accept that unfulfilled potential is inevitable or acceptable. The galaxy is worse off for losing Ferrus before he could reach his peak. How many other similar losses happen every day, on smaller scales but no less real for those involved? These lessons, drawn from the life and death of a Primarch in a grimdark science fiction setting, nevertheless carry real weight. They speak to human truths about interpretation, emotion, strength, balance, intention, legacy, and potential. They remind us that even in the most over-the-top fictional settings, there are kernels of genuine wisdom to be found if we look for them. And they help explain why Ferrus Manus matters, why he deserves to be remembered and understood, why he's more than just the first loyal Primarch to die in the Horus heresy. He was a teacher whose teachings were misunderstood, a strategist whose full capabilities were never demonstrated, a craftsman whose greatest works might have been the things he never got the chance to create, a leader whose balanced approach could have shaped the Imperium in profound ways if he'd survived to implement it. He was, in short, exactly what the Imperium needed when it needed it most, and he died before he could provide it. That's the tragedy of Ferrus Manus. That's why he's underrated. And that's why, 10,000 years after his death, his story still resonates with those who take the time to truly understand it. As conclusion, remembering the Gorgon. We've traveled a long road together, from the volcanic wastes of Medusa to the blood-soaked plains of Istvan V, from the forge chambers beneath Mount Narodnia to the shattered halls where the modern Iron Hands wage their endless war. We've explored the life of a Primarch who deserves far more recognition than he typically receives, a warrior whose significance is often overshadowed by the circumstances of his death and the misinterpretation of his legacy. Ferrus Manus was not perfect. He had flaws, as all the Primarchs did. His temper could override his judgment when properly provoked. His drive for constant improvement sometimes blinded him to the value of what already existed. His harsh upbringing on Medusa shaped a philosophy that, while not as extreme as his sons would later take it, could sometimes err on the side of unnecessary hardship. But his strengths far outweighed his weaknesses. He was a strategic genius, whose capabilities were recognized by the finest military minds among his brothers. He was a craftsman whose works inspired awe in beings who had witnessed wonders beyond mortal comprehension. He was a leader who commanded absolute loyalty through personal example rather than charisma or fear. He was a teacher whose actual lessons, if they'd been properly understood and followed, could have shaped the Imperium in profoundly positive ways. Most importantly, he represented a balance that the Imperium desperately needed. In a brotherhood increasingly defined by extremes, where Primarchs were falling into the traps of their own obsessions and flaws. Ferrus stood for the idea that you could pursue excellence without descending into madness, that you could be strong without being cruel, that you could embrace technology without rejecting humanity, that you could demand the best from yourself and others without losing compassion in the process. The Imperium lost something irreplaceable when Fulgrim's blade took Ferrus's head on Istvan V. It lost a military leader whose full potential was never realized. It lost a moderating voice that could have prevented some of the worst excesses of the heresy and its aftermath. It lost a bridge between the Mechanicum and the wider imperial military structure. It lost an example of how to pursue improvement without sacrificing what makes us human. And perhaps most tragically, as the Iron Hands lost their father before he could correct the misunderstandings that were already taking root in his legion. They were left to interpret his teachings without his guidance, to make assumptions about what he wanted without being able to ask him. And in their grief and trauma, they got it wrong. They took his message of strength through improvement and twisted it into a doctrine of weakness through amputation. They looked at his example and saw only the surface, missing the deeper truths he was trying to communicate. For 10,000 years, they've waged war in his name while becoming the opposite of what he wanted them to be. They cut away their flesh, thinking it honors him, not knowing he planned to strip the living metal from his own hands to show them that such augmentation was a tool, not an ideal. They suppress their emotions, thinking it makes them strong, not knowing he valued the human capacity for feeling even as he worked to master his own passions. They view compassion as weakness, not understanding that his harsh philosophy was meant to make humanity stronger, not to make them less human. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of Ferrus Manus. Not just that he died, but that his death prevented him from shaping his own legacy, his actual teachings, his real beliefs, his genuine intentions. All of these have been buried under 10,000 years of misinterpretation. The modern Imperium doesn't know the real Ferrus Manus. They know a distorted version, a legend shaped more by the Iron Hand's trauma than by historical reality. But we can change this. We can look at the actual evidence of who Ferrus was and what he believed. We can read the Nymeral scrolls where he explicitly states his intentions to course-correct his legion's growing obsession with bionics. We can examine his relationships with his brothers and see the bonds of genuine friendship and mutual respect. We can study his campaigns and recognize the strategic brilliance that made Guilliman identify him as the key to the Dauntless Few. We can appreciate his craftsmanship and understand that beauty and function were inseparable in his philosophy. We can remember Ferrus Manus not just as the first loyal Primarch to die, but as the brilliant strategist, master craftsman, balanced philosopher, and essential leader that he actually was. We can recognize that his early death robbed the Imperium of capabilities it desperately needed and has never adequately replaced. We can understand that the tragedy of his story isn't just in how he died, but in what might have been if he had lived. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn from his example. We can pursue strength without sacrificing our humanity. We can work to overcome our weaknesses without cutting away pieces of ourselves. We can balance seemingly opposed values rather than swinging to extremes. We can be loyal without being blind, effective without being cruel, determined without being inflexible. These lessons matter, not just in the context of Warhammer 40,000 lore, but in how we approach our own lives and challenges. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is, by design, an exaggerated nightmare where everything is taken to horrible extremes. But the core truths that Ferrus Manus represented, the balance and wisdom he tried to teach, and these remain valuable regardless of setting. So when you think about the Horus heresy, when you consider which Primarchs were most significant, don't forget Ferrus Manus. Don't let his early death and the misinterpretation of his legacy overshadow his actual importance. Remember him as Guilliman did, as the key to the Dauntless Few, the brother whose loss was felt more keenly than almost any other. Remember him as the Gorgon, the Primarch with living metal hands, who nevertheless understood that humanity was more valuable than any augmentation. The warrior who could have been the greatest among them all if fate hadn't cut his story short. The teacher whose students fail to understand his lessons, but who bears no responsibility for their failure. Ferrus Manus deserves better than to be remembered primarily as Fulgrim's victim, or as the inadvertent inspiration for the Iron Hand's self-destructive philosophy. He deserves to be recognized for what he actually was, one of the most capable, balanced, and essential Primarchs the Emperor ever created. A leader whose full potential was never realized, but whose actual achievements were nevertheless remarkable. A craftsman whose works inspired awe. A strategist whose brilliance was acknowledged by the finest military minds in the Imperium. A Primarch who, more than most, embodied what the Emperor hoped his sons could become. That's who Ferrus Manus was. That's why he matters. And that's why, even 10,000 years after his death, even with his legacy so thoroughly misunderstood, his story still has the power to move us, teach us, and remind us of what was lost when the heresy tore the Imperium apart. The Gorgon is dead. Long live the memory of who he actually was, what he truly believed, and what he might have become. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the life and legacy of Ferrus Manus, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to explore in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So many characters whose significance has been overlooked or misunderstood. So many lessons to be drawn from this incredibly rich setting. The Emperor protects, but knowledge enlightens. And understanding the true history of the Imperium's heroes, not the legends and distortions, but the actual truth of who they were, that's how we honor their memory and learn from their examples. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the story of the most underrated Primarch in Warhammer 40,000. May the Gorgon's memory, his real memory, never be forgotten. For Ferrus Manus, for the Iron Hands that could have been, for the lessons that remain relevant even across the millennia. Until next time.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.